Order, please. The Honourable Premier.
House for giving me the opportunity to stand and say a few words, and I know members from the opposition parties will do as well. I'm sure the member from Inverness will be able to speak in Gaelic. I'll leave that up to you. I won't punish the rest of the House with that. But indeed, Mr. Speaker, last week Nova Scotia and Canada lost a tremendous parliamentarian, someone who Nova Scotians have looked up to for half a century when it comes to public life, and that was the loss of Allan J. MacEachen, better known in these parts as Allan J. It's one of the few elected officials who have gone to such high esteem, but has never lost the title of Allan J. When people speak about him, they speak with great affection. It's been a week of outpouring of affection, not only from Nova Scotians, but Canadians who've talked about the impact that Allan J. had on this country. For some of us, his impact began before we were even here. And the things that he touched, like Medicare, Labour Standards Code, the investment that he made in making sure that low-income seniors had a supplement, all of those things are just part of our way of life today for most of us. We didn't realize the journey that Allan J. took to make sure those things were in place so that vulnerable Nova Scotians that would be looked after, ensuring that health care was indeed a right for every Canadian, working across party lines. Last week in Antigonish, last Sunday, one of the things that struck me, and I think sometimes is lost in our current public life, was the outpouring across party lines. He had the ability to reach across into New Democratic caucuses, into Conservative caucuses, and indeed his own, to make sure that he fought for public policy that made sense for Canadians. And I think much of what he took to the House of Commons came from his parents in Inverness. Often you hear people talk about the things that he would have seen growing up, the poverty, the men going to work without pensions, all of the things that he took and built and made become part of who he was. It shaped the man. And no matter how high he climbed in his career, whether it's as Deputy Prime Minister, I like to prefer to refer to him as Nova Scotia's Right Honourable. No matter how hard he climbed, he never forgot the struggle of his parents, and those are the people that he was elected to represent. I think one of the things that was extraordinary when people were speaking of him in the last few days, it was never, I think one of the persons said he would one day be meeting Henry Kissinger, and the next day he made sure to get back home to the kitchen tables of Inverness County and the very people he wanted to represent, and it's where he was most comfortable. It's where he wanted to be. He ran to make a difference in the lives of the people of Inverness, and indeed by doing so, he made a difference in the lives of Canadians and in Nova Scotians. There are so many young Nova Scotians that he took under his wing and gave them an opportunity to see the great institutions in Canada. Some of them went on to become premiers, senators, in the diplomatic corps, and some of them came back to this province and have had a huge impact in the profession they've chosen to practice. But all of them were impacted by Allan J. giving them an opportunity to go and see the halls of democracy in Canada and the impact that they would have on the country and the good that can come out of them. And I think one of the things that is sometimes lost, and I know all of us in this House know how important this institution is, but Allan J. lived his institution. He could have done other things. He could have gone and done other things. But he believed in the pursuit of good public policy. He believed in the impact that this institution could have on the lives of Canadians and Nova Scotians. And he made sure that he continued to take the values that his parents gave him, the people of Inverness gave him, and he made sure he imprinted those in public policy that reflected the kind of Canada that I think all of us want, and the kind of Canada, quite frankly, that the rest of the world looks at and is envious of today. You know, we are seen as a beacon globally. When you get a chance to go out and people talk about what's happening around the world, this country wasn't founded by accident. There was a lot of hard work, and Allan J.'s effort is part of that. And as Nova Scotians, we should be very proud the fact that one of our own, guy who came from a small town, a small community, took his ideas and his heart and realized no matter how far he went, no matter what he did, He was not going to lose sight of the foundation of who he was that was built from this province, and he was going to impart Nova Scotia values, Inverness values, on our large institutions that would have an impact on generations of Canadians. I'm one who, quite frankly, began to learn a lot more about Allan Jay's legacy, unfortunately, upon his passing. The very things that we take for granted, he worked very hard to make sure they're in place. One of the things the Prime Minister said in his remarks on Sunday, there probably would not be a Charter of Rights in this country today if it wasn't for Allan Jay. His father, the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Pierre Elliott Trudeau, gets recognized for repatriating the Constitution. But Allan Jay was the glue that brought that together. That journey wasn't an easy one. It took a lot longer than the Prime Minister of the day might have wished it had. But to get it across the goal line, it was Allan J. MacEachen who fought for the rights and freedoms of every Canadian to ensure that that Constitution would be repatriated back to Canada. As the Prime Minister said, without his effort, without his hard work, there may not be a Charter of Rights in Canada today. So, Mr. Speaker, as we stand in this House, get an opportunity to recognize the great legacy of Allan J. MacEachen, of Allan Jay, I think it's only fitting at the end of this we take a moment of silence to reflect on the impact that Allan Jay had on our lives, on the lives of this province and the life of this country. As many people have said, probably the greatest parliamentarian post-World War II. He's from Nova Scotia, from Inverness. He never lost sight of that, and nor should we. He never lost sight of the fact that he had the privilege of being an elected official, and through that, he could make a difference in the lives of individuals, and he could also give individuals an opportunity. Young people working in his office, taking a moment to explain to them the journey of how it was for this piece of public policy. That's a privilege that all of us have. That's an opportunity all of us have, to be able to reach out to young people, some of whom are standing here today, welcome, some of whom are standing here today, to show them the importance of this institution and what can happen when good public policy comes together. What can happen when you have the privilege to sit in here to impact the lives of those citizens you are elected to represent. And one of the things Allan Jay learned early on was never forget where you come from. He lost an election. He made sure that was never going to happen to him again. So he made sure he got home to those kitchen tables frequently. I think some people in his I think some current members in that riding may have learned that lesson as well without losing. Just keep showing up to the kitchen tables. But I think, Mr. Speaker, I can't tell you as the Premier of this province, but more importantly, just as a Nova Scotian, how proud I was and how proud I am with the outpouring of affection that came towards Allan Jay and the impact that the boy from Inverness County had on this province and this great country. So, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to hearing from the member from Inverness and the leader of the NDP party as we honour a true Canadian hero.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
The Honourable Allan J. MacEachen, a man of faith who had the wisdom that comes from it. Wisdom that created social programs which have endured decades and will continue to be enjoyed by Canadians well into the future. He was a loyal friend of the clergy, and he believed in the dignity of the person, that each person deserves the opportunity of education, health care, and the welfare of a guaranteed income as they age. Vacrechev lodger ag Allan MacEachen, agus thuairseo rus a gleachas a bheithe, gleachas a thulairché go bhfuil cór ag gacneach sacharin sáisialta. Mar a ha fém swaintse bheith is Chechen Cheer Sheshvach. He came from a place that mattered to him. His upbringing taught him values like generosity and concern for others. While his strength of voice carried him to the second most powerful position in the country, he never forgot his roots. A Gaelic speaker himself, he was a champion of his people, the Gaels. His efforts can be credited with helping to keep the Gaelic language and culture alive through difficult times and place it on a firmer foundation, which will allow their growth and maintenance for generations to come. Vaigle Yilas, Gandachi Abudulga, agus Ganadunya von Danike, Ranike era an Riolog Canada, a Chadalik Eriev as a Huine Kosavai. Vai Nagashkach Ganagail, agus Urike, Gus Arcanan, is our Dulchas, Agleag is an Yerstahug. Strangely, just a week before he passed, I came across some notes that I had taken shortly after my first election on a visit to Ottawa, where I met with him for dinner back in 2010. Now, perhaps it was coincidence, or perhaps one of those experiences common to the Gael, where we sometimes see or have a connection with something before it actually happens. And so I'm able to share with you some of the advice that he shared with me. Be kind to your opponents. Respect them and listen to them, for you will learn from them. Never attack another's personal character. If our best measure is how we treat others, Allan J. provided a good example. Be kind Allan Fiag Canada agus go harach na rachi hain an Internish. See ga anam. He will be forever remembered across Canada and always in his home of Inverness. May he rest in peace.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm honoured to briefly add my voice and the voice of the New Democratic Party to the chorus of tribute that has been raised across Nova Scotia this week in the passing of Allan J. MacEachen. This chorus of tribute has been striking in the way that it has tended out of the vast array of Mr. MacEachen's political accomplishments, in the way that it has tended to concentrate in particular on three of these. His central role in the implementation of Medicare, his pivotal role in the leadership that brought forward the guaranteed income supplement, and his important place in the consolidation of a higher minimum wage in the Canada Labour Code. One therefore cannot thoughtfully survey the accomplishment-filled landscape of Mr. MacEachen's 96 years without registering the thought that what matters in these lives of ours are the places where we reach with scope and courage in the direction of humanity's great egalitarian agenda. Mr. MacEachen's words from an autobiographical reflection of some 20 years ago may stand fittingly before us. These: social and economic change are possible, legitimate, and justified. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. I'd ask that all members rise as we observe a moment of silence in memory of the Honourable Allan J. MacEachen. Thank you. We'll now move on to the daily routine, beginning with presenting and reading of petitions. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today with sadness, but also with profound gratitude, and ask the members of the House of Assembly to join me as we pause to honour Constable Frank Deschênes, the Nova Scotia RCMP officer who was killed on duty last week. Constable Deschênes passed away while providing help to motorists on the highway in New Brunswick. His last act in this world was consistent with the way he lived his life, serving and keeping Canadians safe. Constable Deschênes joined the RCMP in 2004 and was currently serving in Nova Scotia with traffic services. He had a history of going above and beyond to help and was often putting himself in harm's way to ensure the safety of others. In 2008, a 26-year-old woman was in a car stopped on a railroad track near Truro, and a freight train was speeding toward her vehicle. Constable Deschênes acted quickly and tactically as he used his cruiser to push her car off of the tracks with mere seconds to spare before the train went by. It was his bravery that prevented a possible tragedy and derailment of that train. This one act defines a hero, but this heroic act was not his only one. As an RCMP officer for over 12 years, his job was to confront danger. He made sacrifices every day so that we did not have to. But Constable Deschênes was not just an RCMP officer. He was a husband, a son, a brother, and a friend. To his wife, Savannah, his parents, Bertrand and Mary Paul, brother Patrick, and many extended family members, we extend our heartfelt sympathies as you go through this unimaginable time. I know each of them would have played a major role in shaping Frank to become the incredible man that everyone knew him to be. I also want to extend my condolences to the RCMP family, as I know firsthand what a deep impact this loss will have on every member in and beyond the province of Nova Scotia. May you find comfort in one another as you continue to serve like Constable Deschênes with perseverance and bravery. As the Attorney General and Minister of Justice, I want to thank Constable Deschênes for his service to Nova Scotians and to Canadians. There are many people who have returned safely to their families because of his courage. We will forever be indebted to him for his service to our country. I know my members opposite, my colleagues opposite, will also be making statements in the tragic loss of Constable Deschênes. Following that, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that all members of the House join in a moment of silence in his memory. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
I want to begin by thanking the Minister for providing his statement to our office. On behalf of my colleagues in the Progressive Conservative Caucus, I echo the Minister's feelings of sadness, sympathy, and gratitude for Constable Frank Deschênes. In Canada, we are so fortunate to have police officers like Constable Deschênes who willingly risk their lives each day to keep us safe. We often think of police officers as crime fighters, as they are. However, they are also people who stop to help a motorist change a tire or advise a business owner on keeping their store secure. They are brave men and women who simply want to make our communities a better place to live. That's why we are so sad when a police officer is lost in the line of duty. Through the two incidences referenced by the Minister, we know Constable Deschênes was brave and compassionate. He was exceptional, a true hero. There is no doubt he was a hero to those who never had the honour of meeting Constable Deschênes. But he was much more than that to his wife Savannah and to his parents Bertrand and Marie Paul and his brother Patrick. It is difficult to fathom their loss. We in the Progressive Conservative Caucus extend our most sincere and heartfelt condolences to those who knew him best and loved him most. Our hearts also go out to Constable Deschênes' colleagues in the RCMP. I know they feel his loss deeply. They mourn a brother and a fallen hero. Over his 13 years of police service, Constable Frank Deschênes served his country and its citizens bravely. He truly made a difference. That is a wonderful legacy to leave at such a sad time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to take a few moments to also echo the heartfelt sentiments and sympathy offered by the Minister. I hope to hear voices crack more often in this chamber. It means that truth is being spoken. The decision to become a police officer is one which I'm sure no one takes lightly. By committing to serve and protect your fellow citizens, you're inevitably agreeing to put yourself in harm's way for the safety of others. By all accounts, Constable Deschênes performed this duty with courage and integrity. While his life has been taken far too soon, the example he set will live on forever. On behalf of our caucus, I want to extend our heartfelt sympathies to the family, friends, and fellow officers of Constable Deschênes, and especially, because this is what struck me, his new wife, Savannah, who just mourned her husband in the same church where they were wed, and also his parents, who lost a child too soon. While they're no doubt grieving during this time of loss, I hope they can find solace in the fact that he lived a brave and compassionate life dedicated to serving others.
I'd ask that all members please rise as we observe a moment of silence in memory of Constable Francis Deschênes. Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
Order, please. 1 second. I forgot a thing. We'll now move on to government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Not for me to say. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall, number 1, read and table the message from His Honour the Lieutenant Governor transmitting the estimates of sums required for the province of Nova Scotia for the fiscal year ending March 31, 2018 for the consideration of this House. Number 2, table the estimate books. Number 3, table the government business plan. Number 4, table the Crown Corporation's business plans. Number 5, table the estimate and Crown Corporation's business plans resolutions. Number 6, deliver my budget speech. And 7, move that the estimates of sums required for the service of the province for the fiscal year ending March 31, 2018 being supplied to be granted to Her Majesty and the Crown Corporation's business plans be referred to the Committee of the Whole House on Supply. And Mr. Speaker, for the information of the House, the budget will be presented on September 26, 2017.
There has been a request for waiver. We'll just table that. How's that? There we go.
First day on the job.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Alzheimer's disease causes memory loss, disorientation, decreased judgment, as well as changes in personality, mood, and behavior. And whereas every 68 seconds someone develops Alzheimer's disease, making it the most common form of dementia, which is a group of disorders that impairs mental functioning. And whereas Alzheimer's disease is often called a family disease because of the physical and emotional toll it has on family members, caregivers, and friends who are supporting loved ones. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House acknowledge September 21st as World Alzheimer's Day and encourage all Nova Scotians to support efforts to eradicate this terrible disease. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage and Seniors.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas September 22nd to the 30th is National Coaches Week in Nova Scotia. It's a time to celebrate the significant and positive impact coaches have on our young athletes. And whereas this year, National Coaches Week in Nova Scotia will focus on diversity and inclusion within the coaching community, and whereas a number of coaching workshops will be held from Member 2 to Spring Hill to recognize and support the development of many coaches from our rich, diverse culture. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly join me in thanking and acknowledging all volunteer and professional coaches for the work they do to support our young athletes and communities across the province. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the International Day of Peace, or Peace Day, a day for humanity to commit to peace above all differences and to contribute to building a culture of peace, was celebrated on September the 21st. And whereas established in 1981 by the United Nations General Assembly, this year's theme for peace is Together for Peace, Respect, Safety, and Dignity for All. And whereas this global theme focuses on engaging and mobilizing people to show support for refugees and immigrants, aiming to bring people together and remind them of their humanity. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the importance of Peace Day and continue to work to strengthen the ideals of peace throughout our province and globally. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas September 24th to the 30th is National Forest Week, and 2 award-winning Nova Scotian woodlot owners are holding public field days to help celebrate. And whereas on September 23rd, Western Regional winner David Bent will host a field day on his property in Annapolis County. And on September 30th, I'll be joining the Provincial and Central Region Award recipients, Peter and Pat Spicer, and they'll welcome visitors to their woodland in Cumberland County. And whereas our forests provide habitat for our diverse wildlife populations, as well as recreational opportunities and economic benefits, therefore, be it resolved that members of this House recognize outstanding woodland stewards who encourage sustainable woodland management and increase public awareness of the importance of private woodlands. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas arthritis is a chronic disease that affects 212,000 Nova Scotians of all ages, causing pain, swelling, and stiffness, And whereas the Arthritis Society promotes public awareness, provides help to those living with arthritis, and supports innovative research that will ultimately find a cure for this debilitating disease. And whereas Arthritis Awareness Month is focusing on the relationship among arthritis, employment, and education, as well as innovations that will help improve the quality of life for Nova Scotians living with arthritis, therefore be it resolved that all members of the House recognize September as Arthritis Awareness Month and encourage all Nova Scotians to support efforts and activities to eradicate this chronic disease. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. The motion is carried. We'll now move on to introduction of bills. The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Exempt Nova Scotia Residents of the Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary Maritimes from paying vehicle registration and driver's renewal fees. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Exempt Nova Scotia Residents of the Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary Maritimes from paying vehicle registration and driver's renewal fees.
Bill number 1, an act to exempt Nova Scotia residents of the Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary Maritimes from paying vehicle registration and driver's renewal fees.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill, an act to repeal Chapter 1 of the Acts of 2017, the Teachers' Professional Agreement and Classroom Improvements 2017 Act.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Repeal Chapter 1 of the Acts of 2017, the Teachers' Professional Agreement and Classroom Improvements 2017 Act.
Bill number 2, an act to repeal Chapter 1 of the Acts of 2017, the Teachers' Professional Agreement and Classroom Improvements 2017 Act.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. We'll now move on to notices of motion. Statements by members. The Honourable House Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On the night of October 4th, 1967, it was reported that something had crashed into the waters of Shag Harbour, Nova Scotia. At least 11 people saw it, but the object was never identified and only left a residue of yellow foam. It was then referred to as an unidentified flying object by the Navy and the RCMP who searched at the time. And since then, many people flocked to the museum to hear its fascinating tale and explore its hands-on artifacts. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Shag Harbour UFO crash, and is marked with a festival with many surprises in store, including world-renowned keynote speakers. I'd like to take this time to thank the Shag Harbour Incident Society for continuing to engage the community in such a great festival, and look forward to their continued success.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Chebucto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to mark the celebration of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, which began on Wednesday evening and will end tonight, this year marking the start of year 5778. And I'm pleased to recognize the Jewish community of Halifax, including Shar Shalom Synagogue near Oxford and Quinpool in the constituency I serve, and just outside the boundaries of Chebucto, the Beth Israel Synagogue at Coburg and Oxford. Rosh Hashanah is a time to wish everyone a sweet new year, often accompanied by honey cakes and apples dipped in honey. Rosh Hashanah also marks the start of the Jewish high holidays. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Shana Tova.
The Honourable Member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize the late Honourable Allan J. MacEachen. Allan's motivation for change was forged in the crucible of a mining town without benefit of government-backed security programs. based on the then radical faith of to each according to their need. This was to be his life work, or as Allan J. recalled in his own words, putting bread on the table. MacEachen became acknowledged as the go-to behind the scenes, the great oracle of strategies, the repository of all legislative rules of order worth knowing, the very ingredients for getting the big things done. Whether a citizen of this province or across the nation, everyone has directly benefited from MacEachen's works, the chief architect of social progress of his time. His reach is international. Ocean security protection measures enacted by the UN for the enduring benefit of our fishers, the guaranteed income supplement for low-income seniors, and for all citizens, free Medicare. None of these programs were there in 1953 when MacEachen entered public life. They define so well not only the cooperative spirit from Inverness County, but Nova Scotia values brought to Ottawa to become Canadian values.
Order, please. Time allotted for the member statement has expired. The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Courtney Malcolm, Brian Bowden, and Lisa MacDonald were honoured by Molson Canadian for their contributions to Canada during a special 150th anniversary event held in Glasgow in July. Malcolm is a member of both the Pictou County and Nova Scotia Sports Hall of Fame, recognized for his contributions as a coach, official, and administrator in hockey, track and field, and baseball. Bowden is a well-known singer and MacDonald's CAO of the town of New Glasgow. They are both known for their commitment and dedication to their community through numerous hours of volunteerism. A total of 1,500 Canadians were honoured. Lisa MacDonald was also awarded one of the iconic Molson Canadian Red Fridges for her leadership in the community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, I want to note the absence of an issue of great public importance from the throne speech yesterday. Around the world, scientists and political leaders are grappling with climate change as an environmental and humanitarian crisis, yet it didn't merit mention. 1 year ago, many of my fellow members were making member statements about dry wells after a prolonged drought in Nova Scotia. While I'm grateful for the beautiful summer we had, far from the fires in British Columbia and for now the hurricanes of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, the issue of our time and of our future is anything but far from our mind. And it is alarming to me that this government does not deem it worthy of mention. As the elected representatives of the people of Nova Scotia, our leadership is required.
The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to take a moment to recognize Yarmouth's Megan Hatfield, Cass LeBlanc, and Joey Benoit, who were the organizers of Yarmouth's first ever Pride Parade. The parade was held on September 16th and was a huge success. Many individuals, groups, and businesses participated, and Main Street was filled with spectators of all ages from all over our community. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy and proud that Yarmouth was the site of such a loving and inclusive event. I ask that members of this House of Assembly join me in thanking Megan, Cass, and Joey, and all the volunteers for their hours of hard work and dedication to seeing this wonderful idea come to life in our community. I'm sure this was the first of many Pride Parades in Yarmouth. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize Cam Russell, a Dartmouth East resident and Halifax Mooseheads general manager. As a former head coach and current general manager, Cam has been a huge part of keeping the Halifax Mooseheads franchise strong in our community, from engaging the team members in volunteering opportunities to keeping the team present and humble. Cam ensures his players are positive ambassadors for the City of Halifax. I wish to commend Cam for his many contributions to our community and province and wish the Mooseheads nothing but success in the season ahead. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to rise today and recognize all of the hard-working early childhood educators in this province and in my constituency of Dartmouth South. I sit in this chamber today only because I know that my son is safe at Dartmouth Daycare with people who love him and whom he loves, and that my daughters are also engaged, nourished, and protected by the amazing teachers they are so lucky to have and whom I would also like to recognize. Of course, my husband does play a part, Mr. Speaker, but without those supports, I could not be here today as part of this historic caucus. I know that others are not so fortunate, and so at last I want to make sure to recognize all of those parents in our province struggling to find safe, compassionate, affordable care for their young children, and to tell them that I am here working on their behalf.
Just like to remind all members, please respect the path of travel here between the Speaker's dais and those speaking on the floor. The Honourable Member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take a moment to recognize Petite Riviere Elementary School for their great work in helping our environment. The school recently took part in the 2017 Plastic Bag Grab Challenge. This elementary school of about 100 children collected 2,096 plastic bags, which in turn diverts 16.8 kilograms of plastics from landfills. From what I have heard, students had a great time taking part and learning valuable lessons in reducing, reusing, and recycling. I'd like to acknowledge Petite Riviere Elementary School Principal Scott Rodding, Guidance Counselor Christy Boutlier, and all staff at the school for teaching our students how to be community leaders and good environmental stewards. I would ask members of this House of Assembly to please join me in congratulating all of the students who took part. They are an example to us all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to acknowledge the efforts of the Upper Stewiacke Volunteer Fire Brigade, which, with 50 volunteer firefighters and 4 trucks, is celebrating 70 years of service in 2017. Like those in communities across the country, these volunteers risk their lives for family and friends, neighbours, and their hall is truly a place that brings community together. At this year's banquet, 8 of the brigade's 50 members received awards recognizing a total of 185 years of service. Another award recipient, Bailey Crow, was one of the brigade's junior members who received training but does not participate in firefighting. With such training programs, brigades prepare for emergencies of both the present and the future. Congratulations to the Upper Stewiacke Volunteer Fire Department and its members. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank and congratulate Wayne Carter and his staff at FIN, the Atlantic International Film Festival, for once again curating an engaging and challenging roster of films from Nova Scotia, Canada, and around the world. Of particular note at the festival are the movies made by local filmmakers like Black Cop by Corey Bowles, The Child Remains by Michael Melski, and Pearls by Dartmouth North's writer and director Shelley Thompson, and so many more. Since the government's decision to cancel the film tax credit, Nova Scotia filmmakers have had to face serious challenges in getting their work made, and I applaud them for their endurance and tenacity during this struggle. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Atlantic.
Mr. Speaker, growing up in Herring Cove, I had the privilege to grow up as one of Marg's boys. Margaret and Harry Poole opened their house to help raise me and several other youth, including Sean, Eddie, Jeff, Mike, and Chris. Marg taught us manners and family. Harry taught us strength and hard work. Marg and Harry had 2 biological children, Mark and Craig. 15 years ago, Marg and Harry lost their youngest son, Mark, in a tragic car accident. To say that that changed everyone's life is an understatement. This past February, Marg passed away peacefully, surrounded by love. Harry passed away Wednesday after a battle with cancer, but I suspect it was a broken heart that he finally gave in as he missed Marg so much. As I sat up at their house last night, house empty, I remember how full of life that house used to be. To their oldest son, Craig, you're not alone. Besides your beautiful wife and daughters, you still have Marg's boys. I will always hear Harry's words ringing in my ears. Brendan, shut up and get back to work. Rest in peace, Marg and Harry.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in the House for my first time, and I'm honoured to be able to do so to send congratulations to high school English teacher Bernie Scott. In addition to his many years of dedicated service in educating young people, Mr. Scott's gone the extra mile in ensuring that young people also receive vital extra training and life skills. His most recent project is a collaboration with the Sackville Volunteer Fighters on the Emergency Service Achievement Program. In June of this year, almost a dozen young people graduated with the vital work experience, thereby assisting them in obtaining employment and providing employees with skilled workers. I'd like to thank Mr. Scott for his continued enthusiasm and commitment to both young people and the broader community. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Halifax-Shabukdo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this week, Atlantic Film Festival audiences were treated to the Nova Scotia premiere in Halifax of Halifax resident Corey Bowles' feature film, Black Cop. This film marks a milestone in an interdisciplinary career that has included works in film, television, music, and installation. Black Cop masterfully explores themes of revenge and resistance while addressing topics such as anti-black racism and state violence. As Corey Bowles has explained it, his film is an examination of a world that people think is black and white, but is actually so much more. I want to congratulate Corey on the momentous achievement of Black Cop and on the attention and examination it has brought to the feature's important subject. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Antigonish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It feels good to be back for a second term representing the constituents of Antigonish in this House. And like any election, there is much work and long hours put in by many, and I'd be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to thank them. First, I would like to thank the members of my campaign team and the volunteers who supported our effort. From the young people who came knocking on doors with me to the seasoned campaign veterans who organized and ran the campaign office. They all played an integral part in achieving the results we did. While there are too many of them to name here, I hope they all know that I sincerely appreciate their efforts. I would also like to acknowledge the local candidates, Ray Maddie, Morag McGilvery, and Ryan Smith, for their willingness to put their names forward to serve the residents of Antigonish. Finally, I would like to thank everyone who made their voices heard on Election Day. Whether you cast a ballot for me or any of the other candidates, I was happy to see the constituents of Antigonish exercise their right to choose their representative. I'm grateful that they have selected me to represent them once again, and I promise to perform my duties to the absolute best of my ability. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to rise today to acknowledge Darlene McDonald, Deschênes Centre Manager, and her tall ship crew of more than 100 volunteers for making the RDV 2017 Tall Ship Regatta Pictou a huge success and a ray of sunshine on a gloomy weekend. Pictou was one of the 11 ports around Nova Scotia where tall ships stopped to honour the 150th anniversary of Canada Confederation. Darlene and the volunteers worked tirelessly to bring together an event-packed, fun-filled weekend for people of all ages. They worked around the clock to make sure that Pictou's hospitality was highlighted and that everyone was welcomed. We saw more than 16,000 people visit Pier C to see the magic of the tall ships. Mr. Speaker, I congratulate Darlene and the Tall Ship Regatta Pictou volunteers on such an amazing weekend and for their unflagging volunteerism and commitment to Pictou. Thank you.
The honourable member for Preston Dartmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize Chesley Provo of East Preston on her success as a member of the St. Francis Xavier University ex-women's basketball team. Chesley is a graduate of Auburn High School and indicates that she has learned a great deal from her older brother, who is a member of the men's X-team as well. Chesley's greatest attribute, according to her coach, is her composure under pressure, a hallmark of any top point guard. Chesley credits her large family as a source of guidance and inspiration to work hard. I would ask members of this House of Assembly to join me in congratulating Chesley Provo on her many successes at St. Francis Xavier University. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge that Tuesday, September 19th, marked the opening of the 131st Queens County Fair in Caledonia. This genuine historic agricultural fair in North Queens takes place over 5 days and includes many exhibits from all over Nova Scotia. Since its inception in 1886, it has become an institution in Queens County, and residents and visitors come together each September to experience the livestock competitions, horsemanship events, exhibits, music, and wonderful food. Mr. Speaker, I'm very honored to congratulate the Board of Directors of this year's exhibition, their committees, and numerous volunteers. I look forward to attending and participating in the fair this weekend and personally congratulate those involved with its organization. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Clare Digby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize Rick Wallace and James Baxter, co-organizers of the Breaking Waves Festival in Freeport and the festival's many volunteers for hosting their second annual Breaking Waves Festival. Last year, Mr. Wallace and Mr. Baxter wanted to organize an event where the community could get together and have some fun. After the first successful event, the organizers decided to hold this music festival and film festival annually and expanded it to 2 days. The festival opened Friday night with the opening gala and awards presentation. The film award winners were screened the following day at the Freeport Community Hall. This was held in conjunction with the music portion of the festival at the Freeport Ball Field, which featured a lineup of Nova Scotia musicians, an exhibition of local artists, and food vendors. In all of our small communities, it's important that we organize activities where we can all meet and have some fun. It is nice to see these activities promote local artists and musicians in our areas. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to thank Rob Smith, the local contractor. Rob remodeled his building, which had unused space, to create underground entertainment, a venue that would provide Friday night dances with live bands to those 19 and over. Saturday would have children's dances for kids 7 to 12. The facility could also be rented for receptions, birthday parties, graduation parties, showers, and other special events. Rob saw the need for a community hall to serve the community and has filled that void. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Rob and his crew for the creation of underground entertainment and the positive impact it has had on the greater North Side. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Guysborough Eastern Shore Tracadie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to take the opportunity to recognize and thank those who played a crucial role in my standing before you today. For 30 days and many days and weeks leading up to the election call, our campaign team dedicated their time and energy to my re-election. With their unwavering support, we made it to the finish line. I would especially like to thank my official agent, Don Grant, my campaign manager, Jack Hanafan, and my office manager, Beverly Simpson. Your professionalism and experience led us through a smooth and successful campaign. Mr. Speaker, I would sincerely like to thank my fellow candidates, Rob and Marnie, for stepping up and for very well-run professional campaigns. Mr. Speaker, lastly, but most importantly, I would like to thank my wonderful wife, Patricia, and my children. Their support throughout my political career has been my anchor, and I couldn't have done this without them. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, finding a summer camp experience for a child with a chronic disease used to be a daunting task, one that Dave McKeague knew firsthand. As a child, he was diagnosed with cancer and spent the summer in the hospital undergoing a series of operations and chemotherapy. This fueled his desire to open a camp for people living with chronic illness. His drive to create a camp to help children living extraordinary lives to feel ordinary grew stronger, and in 2011 his dream became a reality with the creation of Camp Brigadoon. Mr. Keeg wants children to live an ordinary life, but Mr. Speaker, Mr. Keeg is far from ordinary. He's an extraordinary man who has created an extraordinary experience for children across the Maritimes. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Armdale.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize an important milestone in my faith community. Tomorrow, during a solemn Mass, Reverend Pierre-Michel Azzi, Vicar General of the Eparchy of St. Maroon, Canada, and pastor of my church, Our Lady of Lebanon Parish, Halifax, is being elevated to the ecclesiastical degree of Monseigneur. By the laying of hands by the Maronite Ordinary in Canada, His Excellency Bishop Paul Merwan Tabit, Monsignor Azzi will take on his new title and join us in a celebratory dinner hosted by our parish council. Monsignor Azzi has been a leader in our church for over 11 years. He has led numerous groups, including our youth council, student support program, the Lebanese Cedar Festival, facilitated the founding of the first chapter of the Knights of Columbus in our parish, served the people of Cape Breton, St. John's, Newfoundland, and Prince Edward Island. I ask all members of the House of Assembly to join me in congratulating Monsignor Azzi on his new title and thank him for his contributions he makes to the Maronite Catholic community.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Congratulations to the Cape Breton West Islanders Midget AAA team, TELUS Cup national champions. They were the first team from Atlantic Canada ever to win the tournament in its 44-year history. These young men never gave up. Trailing 4-2 in the third period, they found a way to score twice to put the game into overtime. Then at 5:39 into sudden death, a magical moment rewarded
their hard work and dedication to each other. Mr. Speaker, this team's greatest strength was itself. This was a team that played like a team, everyone for each other. Every player on this team is a star, and all have played their roles during this successful season. Let us also acknowledge the commitment of their parents, coaches and staff, team sponsors, and loyal fans. May we here in Nova Scotia's Legislature wish our Canadian champions well as they look toward the next season of hockey and the opportunities and dreams that lie before them.
The Honourable Member for Bedford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask members of this House of Assembly to join me in congratulating the Bedford Basin Yacht Club on winning Sail Canada's William Abbott Senior Trophy for the Sail Training Program of the Year in 2016. The award recognizes the fine training programs run by dedicated volunteers throughout the country. It's named after one of Canada's most best-known yacht builders who is integral to the training program at his home club. To be eligible for the award, a training program must be run by a club or school member in good standing with Sail Canada, employ Sail Canada certified instructors, and follow the Sail Canada program and use Sail Canada material. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to note that this is only the second time that a Nova Scotia club has won the award. The last time was in 1994 when, you guessed it, the Bedford Basin Yacht Club won it as well. So today the club will begin hosting the provincial championships in the Opta class.
Order, please. Time allotted for the member statement has expired. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. On August 3rd, the Nova Scotia Health Authority announced 16 new doctors would be coming to Cape Breton. Mr. Speaker, it turned out that information was simply wrong. Among other things, they counted 3 doctors who had arrived over a year ago and had already been announced. Mr. Speaker, clearly we have a government that is more interested in political spin than actually providing better health care to Nova Scotians. So I'd like to ask the Premier, what is he doing to ensure that the information Nova Scotians get about their health care is accurate?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question, Mr. Speaker. As you would know, we've committed to continuing to work with communities across the province. The Minister of Health has been travelling across the province, meeting with healthcare providers, meeting with community organizations, meeting with communities who have invested their time, money, and energy in ensuring that their healthcare facilities in their community are there and up and running and vibrant. And the Minister will continue to work with all of our partners to make sure that the appropriate healthcare team is in place.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians can have no faith in that answer when the agency that's been designed by this Premier to deliver health care gives them information that is simply wrong. In fact, that press release that announced 16 new doctors was shredded. Its credibility was shredded by Dr. Mike MacDonald of Cape Breton in a letter 2 days later to the Cape Breton Post, where he pointed out not only the 3 doctors that had already been counted, but that another, in fact, had not signed a contract yet, and still another wasn't sure he was going to go to that area at all, Mr. Speaker, and yet a government press release went out claiming 16 doctors when in fact it wasn't true, Mr. Speaker. How can Nova Scotians trust this government to deliver health care when they are not accurate with the information they provide to the people of Nova Scotia about their own system?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank all those healthcare providers, Mr. Speaker, out there working with our government, working with the Minister of Health to make sure that we deliver health care, the quality health care that Nova Scotians have come to expect and deserve. And we'll continue to work with all of our partners to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that we have the health care team in place.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we should certainly thank Dr. Mike MacDonald for being truthful with the people of Nova Scotia with what's really going on with health care in Cape Breton, rather than defend a press release that played on the hopes of the people of Cape Breton for better health care, Mr. Speaker, that was nothing more than political spin. The Premier gets up and defends that. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is not good enough. Will the Premier now admit the truth? Our health care system in Cape Breton is in crisis and take the right steps to fix it instead of defend the indefensible.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for his question, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud of the work our government has done with the people across this province, continue to invest in health care. The Minister of Finance will stand on her feet next Tuesday, tabling our budget. We'll have an investment in health care. And I'm really grateful for the people of Nova Scotia who gave us an opportunity to have a second majority in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, back in May, in the course of the election, I had the opportunity on a number of occasions to ask the Premier whether or not, in his view, there was a crisis in Nova Scotia health care. And on every such occasion, the Premier indicated that, in his view, this was not the right way to be characterizing the health care situation in Nova Scotia at the moment. And yet, according to Statistics Canada, since this government took office, the proportion of people without a family doctor has gone to 13% from 9%. And so I want to ask the Premier now, are you willing now to admit, is he willing now to admit that there is a healthcare crisis in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. I want to thank all those community members across the province who are working with our government to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that the healthcare teams are in place in their communities. We know there are pockets in this province where physicians are required. We know there are pockets where we need more nurses, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to work with those communities to make sure that the healthcare that they deserve and require is in place.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in August, 2 residents of Halifax, Chebucto, Teresa and Walter Zukauskas, learned that they would be losing their doctor in early November. Mr. Zukauskas was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2010, and since then he's had 3 different family doctors. He's on 9 different medications at any given time, uses a wheelchair, and received home care 7 days a week, but he needs a medical professional to monitor his condition. Mr. Speaker, the Zukauskas have demonstrated significant medical need, but cannot find a doctor. Does the Premier not believe that their circumstances constitute a crisis?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. As we know, there are families across the province who are looking for and require a healthcare team, Mr. Speaker, a family physician. We know when those families are, the anxiety that families feel when they not have the access to that primary care. It's why we're continuing to work with our partners very hard to ensure that we have in place the appropriate healthcare teams to be able to provide care to those families.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Yesterday, All Nova Scotia reported that doctors in this province have all but lost confidence in this government. According to a Doctors Nova Scotia report also published yesterday, consultations held with doctors at 29 separate meetings around the province found that doctors are burning out and that patients, as a result, are suffering. The President of Doctors Nova Scotia speaks of the situations having reached, these are his words, their words, a tipping point. And so I find it entirely reasonable to ask, if this is not a crisis, I wish to ask the Premier, then what is?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. I want to thank those healthcare providers across the province who are continuing to work with our government to ensure that the appropriate healthcare is in place in communities across Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, wait times for adult mental health services have taken another big jump on Cape Breton Island. In May, the average wait time for mental health services was 354 days. That's almost a year, Mr. Speaker. Today, that number has jumped again to over 425 days, and I'll table the government's own report that proves it, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Premier a simple question. Why do Cape Bretoners have to wait 425 days to get the mental health services that they need?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, that wait time is too long, and we're going to continue to work, Mr. Speaker, with our healthcare providers to ensure that every Nova Scotian who requires access to mental health services are going to get it, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we have been bringing the crisis in mental health service delivery to this House for over 3 years now. The government has acknowledged it's a problem for over 3 years now. The Premier continues to rehash the same promise that someday they will actually do something for the families that have a family member who is a mental illness, who may be in crisis, Mr. Speaker, but the wait lists just go up. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier why, in the face of such evidence of hardship in our mental health system, has this government failed to act to help families in mental health crisis?
The Honourable Premier. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the members for the question. I also want to thank Dr. Stan Kuchar, who's been working very hard with our government to ensure that we go in and identify the challenges being faced in communities across the province. He's made recommendations. The Minister of Health is implementing those recommendations. We know there's still more work to do. We're going to continue to make those investments. As the Minister of Finance stands on her feet next week, there will be additional investments in healthcare, and we're looking forward to continue to work with our partner, because I agree with the honourable member that wait list is too long. And we need to continue to work with all of the healthcare providers to ensure that we bring that wait list down.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, people are talking in New Waterford. They've seen cuts to services in their community over the years. They're worried that the cuts aren't done yet, Mr. Speaker. While the Minister has said he's committed to improving health care, we haven't seen much evidence of that where I'm from over the last 4 years. And my constituents are worried that the situation we're in right now will only get worse. The combination of emergency room closures, staffing shortages, and removal of services has people in New Waterford feeling nervous about the future of healthcare in our town. Mr. Speaker, all summer the Minister has not responded to my requests for a meeting. Now that we're face to face, will the Minister of Health and Wellness give me his word that no more frontline healthcare services will be removed from Cape Breton Centre?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member opposite for the question. As she would know, Mr. Speaker, as part of my work in the first few months in my role as the Minister of Health and Wellness, it's included a tour of the province, meeting with frontline healthcare professionals, touring facilities, practices, and so on, and that included a visit down to the New Waterford area to visit the facility, have those conversations, to hear firsthand from people within her community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, in June of this year, I wrote to the Minister of Health to express my concerns about the future of New Waterford Consolidated Hospital. After a year of many emergency room closures, the mobile care team was taken off duty for the summer, and nursing staff were reassigned to the regional hospital in Sydney. It is now September, and as of last Friday, the summer nursing schedule has been extended until January 2018, leaving people in my riding without access to the emergency health care that they need. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister of Health and Wellness whether residents of New Waterford should expect their closure, the hospital to close permanently, or if he can guarantee that we will not lose services at the New Waterford Consolidated Hospital.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, what I can assure the member opposite and members of her community is that this government, through our partners and through the Nova Scotia Health Authority, the IWK, and other healthcare providers throughout the province will continue to work diligently to provide the necessary services in the healthcare system. That includes, Mr. Speaker, emergency services, making use of the resources within the community, within New Waterford and throughout Cape Breton and the rest of the province, Mr. Speaker, to ensure we can provide the best services to the people of Nova Scotia that we can. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the federal Liberal government is planning a massive tax grab on the small business owners of the province of Nova Scotia and indeed the entire country. Mr. Speaker, the federal Liberals have labelled our own employers here in Nova Scotia as tax cheats, as people are owed to not pay their fair share, Mr. Speaker, instead of recognize them for what they are, which are the people that make our economy grow. In the face of this pending hardship, our Premier has had nothing to say publicly, Mr. Speaker, to defend Nova Scotia employers. Obviously, the Premier is putting the needs of the Liberal Party ahead of the needs of small businesses here in Nova Scotia. I'd like to ask the Premier, why is he staying silent in the face of such a massive tax grab against Nova Scotia small businesses?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to remind the honourable member that Nova Scotians have decided that I haven't remained silent on their issues for the last 3.5 years and give me the privilege to stand here again.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to again remind the honourable member, as I worked not only with this federal government but the previous federal government, I've had many discussions with senior members of both governments, Mr. Speaker. The only difference is, unlike the honourable member...
Order, please. The Honourable Premier.
The only difference is, unlike the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, I don't run for a microphone to disclose every conversation I have.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the people of Nova Scotia, as much as it pains me to say this, did put that Premier in that Premier's chair, and they expect him to stand up and defend them. They expect him to stand up and defend them when they are called tax cheats, when they are made to feel like they're doing something wrong because they're employing fellow Nova Scotians and making our economy grow through our small businesses, Mr. Speaker. He can defend the backroom deals that he makes as much as he wants, but people want to know where he stands. Does the Premier support the federal tax changes, yes or no?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians know where I stand. I stand directly with them.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, no, Mr. Speaker, they don't know where he stands on this very important issue because he won't say. What they are beginning to realize is that when given a choice between supporting the Liberal Party and its needs and supporting the small businesses owners of Nova Scotia, he supports the Liberal Party. And that is not right, Mr. Speaker. That is not right. Our economy is at risk. 40 different small business groups have written to this Premier and asked him to speak up, and yet he has not. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why won't he say publicly now that he's against the small business tax changes that the federal Liberal government is imposing on Nova Scotia businesses?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to correct the honourable member. That decision has not been made. Whether or not that tax changes that he's referring to will be implemented, there's an opportunity.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier.
Opportunity, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, there will be an opportunity for all Nova Scotians to express how they feel about those changes, whether in favour or against. I'm taking that opportunity, Mr. Speaker, at the highest level in government to express the position and concerns that have been raised to us by not only small business owners in terms of those that are out there, but our healthcare professionals that are in who express their concern. We're making those expressions on their behalf to the federal government, and I look forward to continuing to do that, and we'll see what happens, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, apparently the Premier does have a position on this, but it's a secret position, and Nova Scotians aren't allowed to know what it is. Every Nova Scotian has the ability to provide their input, but they are not allowed to know what the Premier himself thinks of these federal Liberal tax changes. That is a bizarre and ridiculous position for the Premier of Nova Scotia to take. You know, Mr. Speaker, it is not lost on the small business owners here that this tax grab won't only benefit the federal government, but that the provincial government will get a windfall in new taxes as well. So I'd like to ask the Premier, how much money is his government going to make if these tax changes go through?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to tell the honourable member that may be how he's focused on this issue, Mr. Speaker. That's not the position that we've taken as a government. There's a broader issue, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the impact this will have. We've heard very clearly from doctors across the province the impact. I've heard from small business owners, Mr. Speaker, the impact that this would have on their businesses, and we're communicating that to the national level, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to do so.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This government made a lot of empty promises about improving health care during the last election. Now, you know what? We welcome any and all initiatives that improve the health and wellness of people of this province, but we believe it should receive accurate information. In the 2017 Liberal platform, it reads, we have increased funding by $8.1 million each year as a part of a long-waiter strategy, and I will table that document. Yet according to every budget address tabled by the Liberal government, number one, those numbers are wrong, and I'll give you table number 2. So my question to the minister is, will the minister be sure to provide accurate figures going forward and not use campaign-style rhetoric to conform or comfort Nova Scotians waiting 3 and 4 years for surgery?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. You know, Mr. Speaker, we continue to recognize that we need to do things more efficiently in our healthcare system. That process to improve the services to Nova Scotians, including in the area of surgery, may require doing things a little differently, but it may also require more investment, Mr. Speaker, and I ensure Nova Scotians, the member opposite, that we continue to move forward in that regard. But, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to accuracy of information being presented, Mr. Speaker, I'd encourage the member to be cautious with throwing rocks in a glass house. I'd like to table this message where a statement out of that party referring to factually incorrect information that was not included as part of the release from Mr. Don Mills of CRA. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Well, you know what? It's a good thing we have an Auditor General in this province, a person that can look at everybody's documents and make sure that they're correct. The Auditor General reported that the department is aware of at least $35 million being needed in upfront to address the wait list for orthopedic surgery, and I will table that. The Auditor General pointed out a series of weaknesses in the planning by the department and the failure to deliver on certain planned programs. Mr. Speaker, my question, which documents should Nova Scotians believe? The 2017 Liberal campaign platform or the Auditor General?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I'd like to assure the member opposite, and indeed all Nova Scotians and members of this House of Assembly, Mr. Speaker, that of course the work that we're going to continue to pursue, the work that we've done in the past, and in improving the number of surgeries, doing more surgeries, orthopedic surgeries across the province, Mr. Speaker, making changes to ensure that people of the province of Nova Scotia can receive services, including surgery services, not just in their local region, but where wait lists may be shorter in other parts of the province, Mr. Speaker. Those are the steps we're taking to move forward to help address this issue. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development. Mr. Speaker, last year the government completed a review of regulated childcare that included consultation with thousands of Nova Scotians. In the recommendations from that extensive review, there is no mention of pre-primary. Since the government started with the rollout of its pre-primary program, we have heard from families worried that they don't know if or when the programs will start, childcare providers who are concerned about losing staff, and centres that have lost space. I'm not sure where the fire is, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister agree with families and childcare providers that when it comes to programs for our children, it's more important to get things done right, not just to get things done?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Mr. Speaker, we have a problem in Nova Scotia. We know that pre-primary education, because of research, evidence, and other facts that have been presented by experts, is key to providing them a better start. It's linked to lower anxiety levels. It's linked to a better transition to an academic learning environment. It's key to screening for learning disabilities at a younger age so we can better prepare for those students. And only 25% of our kids preschool age in this province are accessing those critical programs, Mr. Speaker. While the opposition parties fight to maintain that status quo, I assure that member and every member in this House, we will move forward on an ambitious agenda because we have high ambitions for our kids.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, I suggest that's an agenda that may come at the cost of childcare for all other ages in this province. And Mr. Speaker, one of the challenges identified by the 2016 review was the insufficient programming for children with diverse and special needs. When I wrote to the Minister with my concerns about inclusion in pre-primary, the Minister's response was that the children in those programs would have access to the same supports they would have in regulated childcare, and I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, is the Minister aware that the review done by his own government found those supports to be inadequate more than 1 year ago?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Mr. Speaker, I took great interest in that member's comments earlier during member statements where she said we need to speak the truth in this House. That member has perpetrated things that are not true, misleading the public.
Order, please. Order, please. I'd like to remind the Minister that we're getting into tricky territory there, implying other members are not telling the truth. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Here are the facts, Mr. Speaker. That member suggested that these pre-primary classes that we are working to implement are not inclusive sites for learning. That is absolutely and unequivocally false. These are inclusive learning sites that will support children of all diverse needs in our classrooms, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very excited to keep moving forward with our partners in the child care sector. We have a vested interest in them. We support that sector to the tune of $55 million a year.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, we have a vested interest in the success
Order,
of our...
please. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, we have a vested interest in the success of our child care sector. We invest in that sector to the tune of $55 million a year. We are in negotiations with the federal government that will see additional funds for that critical sector. I share the same goals as the folks in that sector, that all students, all children in Nova Scotia have to have access to these programs, which you know will have a positive impact on their lives.
Thankfully, the Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Earlier this week, we've all heard of the horrible tragedy that happened in Tatamagouche. As details of the incident are coming out, one aspect of that tragedy is the alleged failure of our healthcare system in addressing mental health. I know all members of this House take issues like this very seriously. We have to ensure the system is not failing Nova Scotians. My question is, has the Minister launched an investigation as to the healthcare services? Were they adequate or not adequate in this particular situation?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for raising the question. Of course, Mr. Speaker, the situation in which he refers to is a tragic situation, and I believe it's fair to say, on behalf of all the members of the Legislature, that our hearts go out to those families and the community affected. What I would like to highlight and caution the member, of course, though, is that this is a situation which is an active investigation ongoing towards the incident and allegations around it. So, Mr. Speaker, it'd be inappropriate to speak to details while such an investigation is ongoing. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you. I'm just happy that the investigation is taking place. In Cape Breton, we know there have been several heartbreaking stories from families who have lost loved ones to mental illness. Last year, another incredibly sad story emerged in the Upper Big Tracadie and the loss of an entire family. Anything that can be done to prevent these struggling with illness, mental illness, from escalating and hurting themselves or others is certainly essential. Will the Minister commit to addressing any gaps in service or weaknesses in the system that can be identified by staff or by doctors?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, a very tragic situation, one that hits particularly close to home, literally speaking, Mr. Speaker, from my own situation there. Mr. Speaker, of course, I can assure the member and all Nova Scotians that the area of mental health and opportunities to improve the services across this province are indeed a priority. It is very important to us, Mr. Speaker. We know that 1 in 5 Canadians do suffer from mental illness throughout their lives, Mr. Speaker. Very important that we work to support those family and community members and our friends throughout this process, and the healthcare system is part of that. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Last month, I met with the Department of Family Medicine to discuss the fact that my constituency of Cole Harbour Eastern Passage doesn't have a single family doctor. I recently received a letter from Dr. Rick Gibson, which followed a meeting that we had, and I'd like to table that. I recently received this letter that stated that the Department of Family Practice would only support a physician who chooses to practice in our community if there's also physician cross-coverage insured. My question to the Minister is, why is this government making it more difficult for our community to recruit a family doctor instead of easier when so many Nova Scotians don't have access to primary care?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. You first acknowledged the first question in the Legislature. Congratulations. But, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the area of family physician recruitment, Mr. Speaker, work is ongoing throughout the province for recruitment. We'll continue those efforts led by the Nova Scotia Health Authority. Mr. Speaker, we heard loud and clear from physicians throughout the province that indeed the intentions of the recruitment process to identify the most acute areas, the areas that were most in need, to prioritise those areas, Mr. Speaker, was not sufficient. That flexibility in working with physicians to identify communities they want to work with, and we're committed to allowing that to proceed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Mr. Speaker, it appears from the letter that I tabled that the people from my constituency must not only recruit one family doctor, they also have to find somebody else to cover for that doctor if they're on vacation or take a professional development day. At a time when our government should be knocking down any barriers that prevent a doctor from servicing my community, they appear to be putting up more and more roadblocks. My question, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Health, will the Minister commit today in this Legislature to working with me and my constituents of Cole Harbour Eastern Passage to secure at least one family doctor rather than working against us? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, what I can assure the member opposite, and indeed I think perhaps even more importantly all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, that in my role it's important that I work on behalf of all Nova Scotians to work with them, with the Nova Scotia Health Authority, the IWK and our healthcare partners to ensure primary care services are provided throughout this province, Mr. Speaker. We made it very clear in our platform commitments that primary care services and improving those across the province is a major commitment, Mr. Speaker. I've been tasked with leading that on behalf of our government and all Nova Scotians in my role. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, nearly 3 years ago, this question is to the Minister of Health. Nearly 3 years ago, the former Minister of Health and Wellness announced this government would proceed with implementing an acquired brain injury strategy. Unfortunately, several years and deadlines have gone by with no progress. This inaction has left thousands of Nova Scotians wondering whether the government is listening. I have a young man in my constituency who's 22. He has been prescribed physio 3 to 4 times a week and has received one treatment since May. This is not acceptable to him or others like him. Question, will the Minister of Health and Wellness provide a timeline for the implementation of an acquired brain injury strategy?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question again. And another first, congratulations on that. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the acquired brain injury strategy, I'd actually like to acknowledge the work of my colleague, the former Minister of Health, current Minister of Community Culture and Heritage, for his work and leadership throughout his term in office to, for the first time ever, put the acquired brain injury initiative, working with acquired brain injury. No, was it? Okay.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
All right. Mr. Speaker, the work that he did with the Acquired Brain Injury Association of Nova Scotia to produce a report that came forward late in 16, Mr. Speaker, I've been working and had recent meetings with the ABANs, the Acquired Brain Injury Association of Nova Scotia, to discuss with them the results of that report. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Brain Injury Association of Nova Scotia recently registered its disappointment with these unexplained delays in delivering a brain injury strategy. Unfortunately, our minister even admitted publicly that he hasn't had an opportunity to read the report. I will table the remarks. Nova Scotians are disappointed that our Minister of Health has not taken the time to read this strategy. Question, Mr. Speaker, is has the minister found time since that article to read this critical consultation report on acquired brain injuries, including the recommendations made to his government?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know what I'd like to make the member opposite aware, and indeed those members of the public, particularly those interested and involved, patients and caregivers and those affected by acquired brain injury, Mr. Speaker, that indeed I have taken many steps since coming in, and the importance of this particular initiative. One of the first organizations that I met with, I reached out to the Acquired Brain Injury Association of Nova Scotia to meet with them very early back in August. Mr. Speaker, to discuss with them the report that was provided. Mr. Speaker, I was briefed on the report. I continue to read through in detail, Mr. Speaker, the report that was provided. But also, Mr. Speaker, after meeting with the Acquired Brain Injury Association of Nova Scotia, made some commitments to move forward on some initiatives that could be done, including ensuring that there's an acquired brain injury lens put towards some other initiatives taking place within the department. For example, in the
Order, please. Time allotted for the member's answer has expired. The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, this question is for the Minister of Labour Relations. Mr. Speaker, 1 month ago on August 22nd, the Liberal government proclaimed the Public Service Sustainability Act. The day the bill was proclaimed, the government announced that they would send the sections of the bill to deal with the wage pattern to the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal. My question for the Minister is, why did he not have the whole bill sent before the courts?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. We believe, Mr. Speaker, that the elements that we have advanced to the court are the basic principles of the argument, and we look forward to the outcome of the court's direction.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I am well aware that the government believes that they can ask the courts to rule what they deem to be the central question. But experts have raised concerns about the constitutionality of freezing the long service award, a benefit that was freely bargained for and agreed to in past negotiations. Mr. Speaker, if the minister is so confident that Bill 148 will pass constitutional muster, would he at least agree that he would have received a clearer answer for all Nova Scotians had he sent the whole bill to the courts rather than just a slice of it?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We believe, and to my colleague's point, expert opinions vary. One of the challenges we face, quite frankly, is that often subject matters have opinions on both sides of the argument. We believe that the argument is grounded in the principles that we've advanced, and we look forward to the outcome of the court's direction.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Health once again. 11 months ago, almost to the day, I stood in this chamber and asked the previous minister about funding for home-based oral cancer medications. Funding that would provide patients the same coverage as facility-based treatments. And that minister, the previous minister, promised that he was looking into it. 11 months ago, Mr. Speaker, is literally quite a lifetime for someone suffering from cancer. Almost a full year later, does the new minister have any good news for patients who have been prescribed home-based oral cancer treatment?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for raising this very important topic in the Legislature today on behalf of individuals across the province who are suffering from cancer and may be prescribed home or take-home or oral-based therapies. Mr. Speaker, I can assure the member opposite that I know firsthand that my predecessor, the current Minister of Community Culture and Heritage, did indeed take that issue very seriously. I know that as the former Minister of Finance, Mr. Speaker, and we're certainly did take that to heart. We made commitments in our platform, and you'll see us continue to move forward on that initiative.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Well, the way I understand it, Mr. Speaker, that the previous Minister of Finance didn't give enough money to the Minister of Health at the time in order to do this. So let's hope that the new Minister of Finance gives the current Minister of Health the money to do this. So, you know what, Mr. Speaker, no news is good news, and if that's good news, I think most Nova Scotians would prefer no news. So we know that home-based cancer treatments reduce burden and stress on both the patient and the healthcare system, yet this government has refused to provide equal coverage to those patients who have been prescribed the form of treatment. Will the minister commit to funding or giving us an indication that maybe in the budget that's coming up in a few days that oral cancer treatments will be covered finally and fairly, equitably to our patients?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, thank you for the question. Mr. Speaker, I can certainly assure the member opposite that a great deal of work has been done, was done before I came into this position, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to have the opportunity, the good work of my predecessor, and working with my colleagues to continue moving forward on this, Mr. Speaker. And as I said, I think Nova Scotians in the near future will see some progress on this important file. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. Earlier this month, Deputy Ministers of Health from across the Atlantic region came together to discuss a regional approach to pharmacare. Now, after how badly the changes to the Seniors Pharmacare program went over last year, it makes sense that this meeting should give us all reason to pause. This government has said time and time again that we will see consultations from one end of this province to the other before any changes are made to Seniors Pharmacare or indeed Pharmacare. So I'd like to ask the Minister today, what was the outcome of these meetings on a regional Pharmacare plan?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, it's very exciting that an initiative that we certainly have been championing here in the province of Nova Scotia to bring this forward as an agenda item to work with our sister provinces in a collaborative initiative to advance really what would be a major enhancement and shift in the delivery of services in our provinces, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, I think it's interesting this morning talking about the role Allan played in making major policy shifts. Indeed, it's very exciting to be part of moves and discussions in that regard. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Mr. Speaker, I wish I could take comfort in the fact that this government is the one leading the charge. We've seen how they roll things out. So this government does not have a good track record on implementing major changes, particularly in our healthcare system, Mr. Speaker. And it does not have the best track record in consulting with Nova Scotians. We heard this government say time and time again it would consult with Nova Scotians from one end of the province to the other on changes to Seniors Pharmacare. They haven't even started that. Mr. Speaker, they haven't even started those consultations, and now they're off chasing a new shiny object. I'd like to ask the minister today. Let's go back to Seniors Pharmacare. Do you actually have any intention of consulting with Nova Scotians? And if so, when might you get around to starting it?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I take a bit of exception to the suggestion that the member opposite made that we don't have a great track record with making changes in our healthcare system, Mr. Speaker, including the conversation about pharmacare and the Seniors Pharmacare program. There's 12,000 more Nova Scotia seniors that are not paying any premiums for their pharmacare in the province because of changes that this
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Just in case the member opposite, Mr. Speaker, missed, I'll restate that that's 12,000 more seniors in the province of Nova Scotia.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
In response to the Pharmacare program, Mr. Speaker, 12,000 more Nova Scotia seniors not paying premiums for their Pharmacare services in the province of Nova Scotia because of changes this government made, Mr. Speaker, and will continue to make positive changes in our healthcare system.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. On August 18, 2016, the Premier re-announced a new agreement between the Nova Scotia Health Authority and the Valley Hospice Foundation for the construction of a new hospice on the site of the Valley Regional Hospital, and I'll table that. During that announcement, the Premier said the residents of the Annapolis Valley have been working tirelessly for this project for over a decade, and soon their dedication will pay off. Well, Mr. Speaker, on April 5, 2017, prior to the election, the Premier visited Cape Breton and promised a new hospice, provincial hospice policy framework to help the Hospice Palliative Care Society of Cape Breton negotiate with the province. And during that time,
does the member have a question?
Reiterated the commitment to the Valley. My question for the Minister is this: when will the residents of the Annapolis Valley see their more than 10 years of effort rewarded with a shovel hit in the ground for the new hospice?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the member opposite reiterating the commitments that have been made and the partnerships that we've entered into with groups like the Valley to move forward on a new hospice in that area, Mr. Speaker. The work that's ongoing in Cape Breton to provide them, well, we've provided them with the framework and discussions as to proposal that they'd be bringing forward that would adhere to that framework, Mr. Speaker. Those works continue. As far as when a shovel hit a ground, Mr. Speaker, I'd have to check in with, again, project managers working on that project. Again, the commitment to move forward is there. That would be really a project-based process for that work, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Speaker, if announcements counted for actual work, we'd be fine. The release that I tabled stated that construction would begin in 2017, and 2017 is 2/3 over, 3/4 over, and the hospice was supposed to be finished by 2019. Mr. Speaker, my question is, we have had a tender awarded in 2013. Has the design work tender, has that design work been finished, and will we see construction begin in 2017?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, thank you again for the question. It's my understanding that both the design work has been completed and indeed a site has been selected, Mr. Speaker. So again, actual work on the initiative continues to move forward, and I look forward, as I believe the people in that community do, to seeing those shovels hit the ground as well. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. On September 12th, Justice Ann Derrick rejected a request to have a young offender carry out the remainder of his sentence at an adult correctional facility. For over a year, this youth has been held in conditions described by Justice Derrick as social isolation, and I'll table that. She ruled that the youth should be returned to Waterville, where he can resume the intensive treatment he had been importantly receiving. Senator Kim Pate also weighed in on this case, saying that the fact that Nova Scotia correctional authorities have resegregated the youth in the face of Judge Derrick's decision is shocking. So I'd like to ask the Minister, was he aware that this youth had been held in segregation for over a year?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. What's important here, Mr. Speaker, is that the health and safety of both offenders and staff are of paramount importance to our government. I want my colleague to know that we will respect the decision of the court. As we speak, correction services in the IWK are working on a plan to facilitate the expectations of the court.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Speaker, right now there is a national conversation happening about the use of segregation and close confinement in our justice system. Through an access to information request, our caucus has learned that the department has undertaken an internal review of its close confinement policies, and I'll table that. This is in contrast to the province of Ontario, which conducted an independent review and released the results to the general public. Mr. Speaker, advocates, the public, and frontline workers deserve to be involved in discussions of how to improve our justice system. So I'd like to ask the Minister, will he commit today to tabling the results of the internal review here in this House?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the elements of that process is to gather information internally first and foremost to address policies and the existing circumstances. But as we evolve, Mr. Speaker, I'm more than prepared to share our findings with my colleague and members of this legislature to ensure that we are all informed and that we continue to prioritize the well-being of both our offenders and our employees who work in those facilities.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last Sunday, over 100 residents of the Northside area gathered to protest the emergency room closures and loss of doctors at the Northside General. The emergency room is supposed to be open daily from 8 to 3 and sees over 10,000 patients a year when it's open. When the emergency room closes, patients must travel over 30 minutes to an already crowded emergency room at Sydney, and that was never built to handle the patients from the North Side. My question to the Minister of Health and Wellness is, will the Minister of Health and Wellness commit today to restoring full emergency room services to the Northside General Hospital?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, the priority of health care in the province of Nova Scotia for the people of the province is a priority, Mr. Speaker. We heard that loud and clear. I think, Mr. Speaker, over the years, all governments recognize the importance of providing health care to our population. We'll continue to expand our investments. Our platform, Mr. Speaker, made it very clear that we heard Nova Scotians, that we were prioritizing, particularly in the area of primary and emergency care, Mr. Speaker. So we'll continue with that work as we move through this mandate. Thank you.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this 8-3, Mr. Speaker, was supposed to be a temporary issue that was going to be corrected. So if this is a priority for this government, I hope that means, yes, he's going to go restore full emergency room services at the North Side. In 2014, lab services changed at the Northside General Hospital, and concerned citizens were worried about the change in the role of our hospital. Long-term care patients started occupying beds that were once designed for short-term care patients and patients recovering from surgery. Earlier this week, I checked that the Northside was advertising for renal dialysis and emergency room nurses, as well as 2 family physicians on the North Side. The citizens in the area deserve better service than the government has provided us. So my question to the Minister: when will the Minister of Health and Wellness come to the Northside General and tell the people of the North Side what the future plan is for our medical facility?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the work of the province, throughout the province, for all Nova Scotians, including those in North Side and across Cape Breton, both industrial Cape Breton and the Strait region, Mr. Speaker, and indeed right across the province, is to continue to work to recruit physicians and frontline healthcare workers, including nurse practitioners and others that can support the services needed by the people of Nova Scotia, particularly in the primary care area, Mr. Speaker. This is an important area, and it's an area that requires work. It's ongoing, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue that commitment, continue working with the people of Nova Scotia and our partners at the Health Authority and the IWK. Thank you.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. During the election, this government promised to target funding for food budgets at long-term care facilities. Of course, it was the same government that stripped food budgets in the first place, leaving seniors with inadequate service. My question is, will the minister commit to immediately restoring the food budgets and long-term care facilities?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
I'll address and reply. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to call address and reply.
We'll now call address and reply. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition with a reminder of 46 minutes left.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to return to my address and reply to the speech from the throne from yesterday. Mr. Speaker, just before I get into a further analysis of the throne speech itself, I do want to take a moment and recognize a number of Nova Scotians, some who were listed in throne speech and some who weren't, who deserve recognition either because they passed away in the past year or because I just feel we should recognize them at this time. In the throne speech itself, Mr. Speaker, the government very appropriately recognized the contributions to our country of Allan J. MacEachen, and all 3 parties spoke eloquently about that. This morning, I just want to add my voice very briefly to those that respect his accomplishments and his contribution to our province and our country. Mr. Speaker, Paul McEwen was a former member of this House. I did have the privilege of knowing Mr. McEwen a little bit, having talked to him on a number of occasions, and I think it's appropriate that he is recognized, and I hope his family takes some comfort from the recognition that he's been provided here. Ralph Fisk is another member of this House, former member who has passed away, another gentleman that I knew a little bit over the last number of years, and I also want to extend our sympathies and thanks to his family at this time. Diane Brushett, a former member of Parliament from Cumberland Colchester, my MP at one time, Mr. Speaker, from my home of Truro. I want to recognize her as well, as she was recognized in the throne speech. the former mayor of Mahone Bay, Joan Feeney, another individual that in my travels I got to know and will miss very much, and want to extend our sympathies to Mr. Feeney's family as well. Do you know, Mr. Speaker, those are politicians, and they've done wonderful things, and I think they deserve our thanks. But I'd like to add a number of examples of people who support the political process as volunteers, who also passed away in the last year, who often don't get the accolades that they deserve, because none of us would be here without them. None of us would have the robust political system that we have without them. I hope members don't mind if I just pause for a moment and recall Alden Turner of New Ross. Mr. Speaker, Alden Turner has worked on PC campaigns for decades and decades, who only recently passed away. I want to give you a sense of how committed he was as a Conservative, Mr. Speaker. He was a farmer, and if you wonder where the only blue-coloured barn is in Nova Scotia, it's Alden's barn in New Ross. He had been sick for a number of years, and I went to visit him last year. And what I remember most about Alden, he was so committed to the cause that he asked to speak to me for a moment on a serious matter because he had a confession to make, Mr. Speaker. And of course, I'm not in the business of receiving confessions, far from it, but he had chosen me to make his confession to in front of his daughter and son-in-law, I might add. And Alden wanted me to know, and he was very serious, he was kind of trembling when he confessed to this, that in fact, he never told anybody, but he had once voted Liberal. And he wanted me to know that, Mr. Speaker. It was in the 1960s, and he had held that secret his whole life, but he felt the time had come to confess. And you know, Mr. Speaker, we can all be gracious. I forgave him for that sin that day, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to do that. So it's Alden Turner, a great, great worker. Along the Eastern Shore, Mr. Speaker, there is another great volunteer supporter of our system, and yes, of our party, who I had the honor to know, and that is Roddy Robertson, who, according to our party records, was the longest-standing continuous member of the Progressive Conservative Party, having maintained his membership annually for 76 consecutive years. He was over 90 when he passed away. He worked on every campaign during those 76 active years of membership, including the May 2017 campaign, and I just think it's important that we recognize the contributions that people like Roddy Robertson make to our political process. And I will name one more, Mr. Speaker, and I know that there are many, many more from all parties besides these three, and that's always the risk when you identify people and single them out. But I know a lot of people in the Sackville area will understand when I mention Hugh MacDonald and his incredible contribution to the community, to our party, and to the citizens of the Sackville area over many years. Hugh lived a full life and passed away just a few weeks ago, and we miss him. And I want to honor him by mentioning him today at this time. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the people that we have lost, there are many who continue to support our process in each of our parties who go without recognition. One person still with us, going strong, who will turn 100 years old next month, is Bill Cox of Shelburne. And I just want to recognize the incredible work that Bill Cox has done for democracy, for the PC party, for the county of Shelburne over those 100 years. I am looking forward to attending his 100th birthday, along with the member for the area, the member for Queen Shelburne. And while I have a moment during address in reply to recognize Bill Cox's pending 100th birthday, I just want to say, on behalf of all of the members of the Legislature, happy 100th birthday to Bill Cox of Shelburne. So, Mr. Speaker, in tribute to all of those people, past and present, that send us here, I think it's important I return to my fair and balanced analysis of the throne speech at this point in time. I said yesterday that it was a disappointment, it has no vision, there is no new action, it is a rehash of the same old promises that never seem to come to any concrete improvements for the people of Nova Scotia. And that the Premier himself had set the tone of lowering expectations among Nova Scotians that anything real would happen as a result of this throne speech or indeed this session of the Legislature. And that is a shame, because we should have a Premier and a government that lifts people up, that gives them hope, that shows them there is a better way. But that's not what we have. What we have is a Premier and a government that likes to push people down, lower their expectations, try to cause them to expect less and less of their government. He specifically pointed to pending cyberbullying legislation, Mr. Speaker, and basically told Nova Scotians not to expect much when the government brings forward the new Cyberbullying Act. And I want to highlight that, Mr. Speaker, because that is a shame. This is one of the modern, serious challenges of our time. It touches on the safety of our young people. It touches on the mental health of our young people and indeed all Nova Scotians. It is a challenge that people want their government to take up and accept and move forward boldly on. Mr. Speaker, the previous NDP government put in their best effort a cyberbullying bill. Yes, the courts have struck it down 2 years ago. And we have been calling on this government to bring forward strong new protections in the area of cyberbullying ever since. And we got the same answer every time. Wait and see, wait and see, wait and see. Meanwhile, Mr. Speaker, young Nova Scotians wonder where to turn when they're being bullied online. Parents worry about their children and how they'll be protected. Teachers, school bus drivers, and social workers, and educational assistants, everyone that works with our young students in our education system, wonder if they'll ever be given the tools they need to intervene and protect young people. Police officers have no guidance from this legislature on what cyberbullying is, whether it's an offense, what the penalties are, how they can go about protecting people or making an arrest, Mr. Speaker, and that is not an acceptable situation. Finally, we're told by this government that they'll be bringing in a new Cyberbullying Act in this session of the Legislature. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, here on this side, we are ready to embrace a strong new cyberbullying bill that will protect people from this awful new modern peril. And yet just days ago, the Premier decided to tell Nova Scotians, it ain't going to be much. Don't expect anything strong. It might not even make it all the way through the Legislature. After 2 years, Mr. Speaker, and all the lawyers that they have at their disposal to find the path forward that respects the Constitution and provides new protections, and we're going to be given what is admitted by the Leader of the Government to be a watered-down bill that may go nowhere. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is very disappointing to hear, not just for us, but for all Nova Scotians that want to see strong action taken in the area of cyberbullying. And yet, what we're given is an exercise in lowering people's expectations. The same with the IWK expense scandal that's going on right now, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians are looking to their government. Where are you on this? Are you offended by this? What are you going to do about this? They are calling out. When their own money, their donations and their taxes that go to the Hospital for Women and Children's Health end up in somebody else's pocketbook, Mr. Speaker. Now it's been referred to the police, and the government has no official position on this. They want to wait and see what somebody else has to say, whether it's the Auditor General or a volunteer board of directors. Mr. Speaker, the government again is doing its best to shift people's attention somewhere else so they don't have to take action, even in the face of such an offensive action at the IWK. Mr. Speaker, I asked the Premier where the government is on these tax increases for small businesses this morning, and as you saw, there is no government position. Or if there is one, it's a secret position, Mr. Speaker, and we're not allowed to know what it is. Well, again, an exercise in pointing the finger somewhere else, lowering expectations that anyone will stand up for our small businesses from the government side, Mr. Speaker. This throne speech confirms what Nova Scotians were sensing, that this is a government that just wants to make sure they don't expect much from them. And that is not right, Mr. Speaker. No wonder only 53% of Nova Scotians voted in the last election, when they had been told for 4 years, don't expect much. Mr. Speaker, one of the most disturbing things about that election was the turnout. Something everybody in this House should be concerned about. 53% is not only a new low, it is a new low by a lot. Mr. Speaker, almost half of the registered voters chose not to vote. They sense there's some disconnect between what their daily lives are all about and what their political leaders are talking about. Mr. Speaker, I don't have all the answers to why that is, and we all bear some responsibility for figuring it out. But one thing I do know, when they have a government that tells them not to expect much, they change the channel to something else. And you know, Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of challenges in Nova Scotia right now. Our economy is stalled. There are job losses that are piling up. Our healthcare system is in crisis. Our mental health system is dissolving before our very eyes, Mr. Speaker. And when people do stand up and support the healthcare system, like making a donation to the IWK, they see some of their own money taken from the very services that they had donated it for, Mr. Speaker. And then they see their government have no position on it, other than that's up to somebody else. No wonder they disengage, Mr. Speaker. A throne speech is supposed to provide a vision of a way forward, a picture of a better day, Mr. Speaker. In the past, governments of all stripes have used their throne speech to give people hope that healthcare will get better, that more doctors will come, that people with mental illness will get the help they need, that young people will have jobs. What happened to those days, Mr. Speaker? What happened to the times when governments actually showed us a little vision? Now we have a government that thinks the throne speech is all about telling people, don't expect too much from us, don't expect things to get better. When there's a problem, we're just here to officially point the finger at somebody else. Well, Mr. Speaker, there is a direct tie-in between the way that this government operates, the way they write these throne speeches, and the low voter turnout that we see in elections today. And that is a shame. You know, Mr. Speaker, one of the big issues of today is our environment, maintaining our pristine bays and harbors. Mr. Speaker, lowering greenhouse gas emissions into our atmosphere, doing our bit as a province to turn around climate change. It is a big, big issue. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, the government had nothing to say about this big issue in their throne speech. Now, some might say that's an omission. Well, it is an omission. The question is, was it a deliberate omission, or did they just forget about the environment? Well, neither of those two options is a good one, Mr. Speaker. But I'm going to suggest to you that it was deliberate, that it was intentional that the throne speech not mention the environment because the Liberal answer on the environment is so wrong, and they know it, and they want to bury it. They don't want people to pay attention to it. But Mr. Speaker, as we watch hurricane after hurricane, Category 4, Category 5, and flood after flood hit major cities in our neighboring country to the south, we know Every country has to stand up and do their bit to clean up the environment and the atmosphere, including this country and including this province. And that's what we are committed to. And I would hope that's what every party is committed to. And yet we have a throne speech that is silent, deliberately silent, because how you go about it is what really matters. We now know from Ottawa and from this provincial Liberal government that the Liberal answer is to tax people more, to put an extra charge on the essentials of life, like home heating fuel, Mr. Speaker, like gas for your car, as if somehow people will just stop heating their home or driving to work and everything will be better. Well, Mr. Speaker, that shows to me that all the Liberals are interested in is using climate change for another tax grab, because it is not proven, in fact it's a fallacy, that that will actually improve greenhouse gas emissions or any other environmental concern. For the very obvious reason that they're taxing the essentials of everyday life. In a province that already has the highest taxes in the country, in a province that already has the highest cost of living in the country, combined with some of the lowest average incomes. Nova Scotians are struggling to pay the bills they have now. They're told we need to act on climate change. We do need to act on climate change. And then they're told the answer is that they have to pay more, Mr. Speaker. So there is no question that in this session of the legislature, this government will bring in a cap-and-trade bill that increases the cost of everyday living and does nothing for the environment, because Nova Scotians will just have to suck it up and pay the extra bill. Well, that is not good enough for Nova Scotians and their pocketbook, and it is not good enough for the environment either, Mr. Speaker. We have the worst of both worlds. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, it's clear where we stand on charging Nova Scotians more. We're against that. We want to find ways to bring the cost of living down. We want to find ways to bring taxes down. We want to find ways to leave a few dollars in their pocketbook so they can live and prosper here. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to say on a positive note that the Progressive Conservative Caucus will be bringing strong and new environmental legislation to this session of the legislature to show Nova Scotians how we can do our bit as part of this country and part of this planet to clean up the environment and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Because if you truly care about the emissions into our atmosphere, if you truly care about climate change, then you will regulate that directly. Make polluters pay. Set real targets for greenhouse gas reduction. Set real targets for nitrous oxide reduction and sulfur dioxide reduction. Set real targets for mercury emissions directly and enforce them, Mr. Speaker. That is the way that Nova Scotia has succeeded before, and it is the way we should go about succeeding on environmental improvement in the future, Mr. Speaker. And I look forward to the day in this session where Nova Scotians examine the cap-and-trade carbon pricing plan the Liberals are going to bring in and calculate the effect on their own pocketbook, on gas prices, on home heating fuel costs, and then look at the package of environmental bills that the Progressive Conservative Party will bring in that don't indirectly talk about the environment through increased taxes, but directly improve the environment by regulating the things that matter to Nova Scotians, like keeping our atmosphere clean and our bays and harbours pristine. That's a clear contrast between the government over there and the PC opposition, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud of it, as we all should be. As you know, Mr. Speaker, put some numbers around this. Professors of economics at St. Mary's University have actually done the math. They have taken the greenhouse gas targets that are being imposed on Nova Scotia from Ottawa over the next 15 years and backwards calculated what that will mean in gas per litre, price per litre, and home heating fuel cost per litre. 9 cents a litre more on gas, 9 cents a litre more on home heating fuel. Mr. Speaker, that is on top of the 15.5-cent provincial excise tax and the 10-cent federal excise tax and the 15% HST that we already pay on our gasoline to drive our cars to get to work, Mr. Speaker. On top of it, I think Nova Scotians would say, well, we already have a carbon tax then. We have a carbon tax of 25.5 cents excise tax and 15% HST. And by the way, the HST is actually a tax on top of the other taxes, as immoral as that is. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? They may wish they could cut back on that bill, but they have to get to work every day. They have to get to the grocery store. They have to get to the drugstore to fill their prescriptions. And in particular, outside the city of Halifax, that means driving a car. And the distance doesn't get less, but the bill will go up under the cap and trade plan of the Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker. That's a bad example, but even worse is what's going to happen to people that heat their homes with home heating fuel. The government says their cap and trade plan is a made in Nova Scotia plan. Well, they should have taken a look at what Nova Scotians actually do. 60% of Nova Scotians heat their home with home heating fuel. We have the highest usage of home heating fuel in all of Canada, Mr. Speaker. They're going to get hit with another 9 cents on their fuel costs to heat their house. Mr. Speaker, we saw what happened when power rates went up. We actually had seniors on fixed pensions in their homes, in their apartments, literally closing off rooms and stuffing towels under the door to keep the heat in the few remaining homes that they could afford to heat. That was an unfair hardship that was imposed on those seniors, Mr. Speaker. Those are the ones that used electricity to heat their homes. And that wasn't enough for the Liberal Party. Now they're focused on the 60% of us that use home heating fuel, and they want to add 9 cents to our home heating fuel bill. Mr. Speaker, how many people are going to heat their homes less? I would hope none, because they can't afford to do that, Mr. Speaker. We shouldn't ask them to do that when there is a better way. And the better way is to directly cut down on the emissions that go into the atmosphere. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? Free up our entrepreneurs, free up our major industries, free up the manufacturing base of this province to actually innovate, to bring their emissions down. That is how it's supposed to work. Rather than tax people more, look to how we incent our business generators, our job generators, to squeeze under ever-lowering emission targets, Mr. Speaker. That's how we move this province forward. And if there is any doubt, I point to the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act of 2007, introduced by a progressive Conservative government, supported by all parties, which actually did this very thing. Set real targets, have them lower over time, set multi-year commitments, clean up the air, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotia is a better place today because of that bill. And we have done our bit and are continuing to do our bit for climate change across this country and around the world. And in fact, the leader of the Liberal Party himself, the Premier, has pointed to that action as a reason why Nova Scotia deserves a break from Ottawa. He didn't win that argument because we still now have this cap and trade bill coming, but he pointed to the accomplishments of this better way to try and make his case. I wish he had won the argument. It was a good argument. We do have a lot to show for ourselves. Our emissions are down, Mr. Speaker. And now we have international agreements like the Paris Accord, which have set new targets for the whole world. And we have a proven way forward that doesn't tax people more. That's what we should be doing, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to the debate when the cap and trade legislation comes in, so we can show Nova Scotians the two ways forward on the environment. Mr. Speaker, there are things in every throne speech that we can all support. So let me turn to a general area of focus that I think that we need to get behind. And that is doing more for the most modest income Nova Scotians. The new disabled Nova Scotia provisions that are pointed to in the throne speech they are a good thing to do. They are a good way forward. And I look forward to the legislation to come in the hopes that it matches the rhetoric that was in the throne speech yesterday. Mr. Speaker, even actions to ensure that Nova Scotians who find themselves on income assistance or who find themselves in need of help from their government are strengthened are a good thing, Mr. Speaker. We want this province to prosper, of course. We also don't want anyone to be left behind as the province grows and prospers in the future. We need to strengthen the supports for people who are not able to provide for themselves. That is a good thing. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, it needs to be matched by a real vision for stronger economic growth and jobs. And there is none in this throne speech. That's where it falls flat, Mr. Speaker, because at the end of the day, for Nova Scotians who are able, the best social program is a job that pays a decent wage, where the government only taxes their fair share and no more, Mr. Speaker, with the dignity and pride and self-reliance that comes with that job. I wish the government had spent some time on this important principle in the throne speech, but they have not, Mr. Speaker. Instead, we have 3 pages on supporting people who don't have jobs. And that's good, but it's only good if we actually have a real vision for providing jobs too. Mr. Speaker, how many people who are on income assistance now would rather be out standing on their own 2 feet with a real job and a real paycheck? A lot of people, Mr. Speaker. And what they want is not more handouts. What they want is that help to get up that first rung of the economic ladder and then to climb as high as they're able, Mr. Speaker. And we support that. We support putting people up on their own 2 feet, giving them the tools they need to become self-reliant, giving them the dignity of a real job, Mr. Speaker. And there's nothing on that in this throne speech. And I say that at a time, Mr. Speaker, where Statistics Canada and their labour force survey continue to report pretty grim news for the province of Nova Scotia. I know here in downtown Halifax, people look and they see that there's a number of cranes up building new buildings. And that's a great thing. That's terrific. But it is not a sign of more jobs, unfortunately. Because the labour force survey for Nova Scotia for the month of August, the most recent one, shows that our unemployment rate jumped a whole percentage point to 8.9, Mr. Speaker. That's at a time when the rest of the country is surging forward with jobs, and Nova Scotia is going the other way. How a throne speech could be brought to this House that has no plan for economic growth when our unemployment rate is climbing is beyond us, Mr. Speaker. And that is not a blip, by the way, in the statistics. Because, Mr. Speaker, in August of 2013, 4 short years ago, when this government was on the verge of being elected, 453,700 Nova Scotians were working. Today, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, only 444,600 Nova Scotians have jobs. That is a loss of 9,100 jobs in the 4-year term of this government. That is 9,100 families that don't have a paycheck, Mr. Speaker. That is 9,100 fellow Nova Scotians who have been robbed of the dignity of work, robbed of the opportunity to stand on their own 2 feet, robbed of the time to be proudly self-reliant, Mr. Speaker, as the employment market continues to shrink. That is roughly the labour force of the town of Truro, Mr. Speaker, that has disappeared in the last 4 years. You know, Mr. Speaker, I think that all Nova Scotians get it, that in addition to the financial hardship that this shows, that's 9,100 fewer people who are also not paying taxes to support our healthcare system or our education system or our community services programs, among other things, Mr. Speaker. So this government wants to go down the road of taxing the remaining people that are working more with cap and trade. I'm sure taxing them more when the marijuana legislation someday finally makes it to this House, Mr. Speaker. But where is the vision for growth? Where's the hope that there might be a way to spark our economy and create jobs, Mr. Speaker? Where are the taxes that we can lower to get people out creating jobs again? Where are the regulations that we can cut back to free up our entrepreneurs to make things happen in our economy? Even when threatened by Ottawa by a massive tax grab on our small businesses, we have a premier and a government that won't stand up against that. Well, Mr. Speaker, 9,100 families in this province are waiting for their government to show them some hope. And yesterday in the throne speech was an opportunity to do that, and yet it did not happen. Mr. Speaker, I will table this document, by the way, for the benefit of the members. In case anyone is wondering where this comes from, it is the Labour Force Survey that is published monthly by Statistics Canada. And I will say this. When the NDP was in and jobs were being lost then, they would point to the global recession, or that all of Canada was suffering, or all of the Western world was suffering. There was some truth to that at the time. Mr. Speaker, it wasn't enough to say, oh, well, the whole world's in recession, what can you do? But at least it was a truthful statement. But now, Mr. Speaker, that same report shows that every other province is moving forward, except Newfoundland. That New Brunswick, PEI, Quebec, Ontario, all the Western provinces, BC, the territories, they're all moving forward. They are growing. So this is not some national economic problem that Nova Scotia somehow has gotten caught up in. The only thing made in Nova Scotia by this government on the economy is the job losses that we are facing while everyone else is surging ahead. Mr. Speaker, I don't think it's a coincidence that our job creators are stuck when we have the highest personal income taxes in the country, the highest sales taxes in the country, in many places the highest property taxes in the country. Mr. Speaker, we've been calling on the government to bring forward a growth plan so that we can actually start to build an economy that allows taxes to come down at least to the national average. Mr. Speaker, there's a little hope. There's a little hope. Free up job creators. Put in place strong and clear rules of the game so we can take advantage of our natural resources to create jobs, Mr. Speaker. Give people a break when they take a risk and mortgage their home and hire their neighbor so that we can have more homemade jobs, Mr. Speaker. But none of that's happening. In the face of our stagnant economy, the government is looking for new ways to tax those of us that remain. Well, that is a vicious circle. The higher the costs go, the fewer jobs that come. The higher the costs go in the remainder, the more people leave. That is the vicious circle that we are on. Well, we want to break that vicious circle. We want to break it and actually turn it into a virtuous circle. Whereas the cost of living comes down and the red tape comes down, then the jobs go up. We can afford to cut the cost of living a little more, the jobs go up higher, Mr. Speaker. That is the proven way. But under this government, it is not the Nova Scotia way. And 9,100 families know it for sure, Mr. Speaker. So where is the vision of more prosperity? We actually need a government that shows us a little hope. And let me say this, Mr. Speaker, it doesn't take a miracle. This province has all it needs to succeed. It has all the resources, all the talent, all the universities, the community college. It has all we need to prosper. We have great ports. We are in the middle of multiple great trading patterns. We're part of the North American Free Trade Agreement. We're part of the European Free Trade Agreement. We're in the middle of both. And we make world-class products, like the world's best lobster fishery, which is headquartered out of Advocate Harbour, Cumberland County, I might add. There may be a few that disagree on that minor point, but my point is, we have all it takes. We should be surging forward. We should be world beaters in Europe. We should be world beaters in Mexico and in the United States. And we should be world beaters in China, which is actually a good story. And yet jobs are going backwards, Mr. Speaker. What is it that's holding us back? Is it our natural resources? No. We have great forests, great fisheries, great potash, you name it, we got it. We have great trade, we have great ports. What is it that's missing? Well, the throne speech actually answered that question, Mr. Speaker. The throne speech answered the question all Nova Scotians are wondering. With all of the ability and prosperity that is right before our eyes, what is missing? And what's missing is a government with the vision and political will to get us there. That is what the throne speech showed today, Mr. Speaker, and yesterday. That instead of having a government that gets us going and shows us, let's go. The future is that way. We can go get it. We have a government that prefers to tell us why we can't have things, why we can't do things, why we should expect less, why we should just go home and give up. That should have been the title of the throne speech, now that I think about it. Nova Scotia, go home and give up. That's what they should have called this throne speech. It summarizes it very well. If you're a teacher or a film worker, Mr. Speaker, you're told go home and give up. If you're out at a bargaining table looking for a decent wage, you're told to go home and give up, and if you don't, we'll impose a solution for you, Mr. Speaker, and the courts are going to spend years spending millions of dollars sorting that out. Now, if you're a small business owner, like the many that I described briefly a moment ago, who has a great idea, who mortgages your house, who works together with your husband or wife to make this business happen, to get it off the ground, who has the nerve to hire a neighbor and put him on the payroll and hopes that this business idea works out, you're told you're a tax cheat by Liberals for having the gall to take that risk, Mr. Speaker. You're told basically, go home and give up. That's what the message of the Liberals in Ottawa is. Or you're a doctor who went through medical school and piled up hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, whose spouse, your husband or wife, probably worked while you were going to school, who you didn't earn a paycheck till you're over 30 years old. And so your working life is maybe 25 years. And you got to pay off your debts. And so you incorporate. And you recognize the contribution that your family has made to putting you in this great position as a doctor. And you're just starting to get out from under that debt, maybe buy a house, and you're almost 40 by that time, Mr. Speaker. And then you have a Liberal government tell you that you're a tax cheat. Mr. Speaker. They're telling you, if you're a doctor, go home, give up. We don't appreciate you. We don't support you. That's what the message of the Liberal government is, Mr. Speaker. And when we have homegrown doctors, whether they're from North Sydney or Weymouth, who have actually gone and gotten their medical degree and are licensed, some of them put up their hand and say, you know what, I'd like to practice at home. They rightly expect that the Liberal government will welcome them into their home communities with open arms. Considering that there are so many Nova Scotian families that don't have a doctor in those places and many others. But that's not what happens. Roadblock after roadblock after roadblock is put in their way, Mr. Speaker. In fact, if you got your medical degree outside the province and then want to come home, you're put at the back of the line, Mr. Speaker. A doctor that wants to be in a rural area, that wants to stay there, that knows the area, that knows the people and wants to provide primary health care is put at the back of the line. And we have brought this issue to this House many times and there's been no action, Mr. Speaker. Those doctors are told to go home and give up. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? Those families in Weymouth, in North Sydney, in Spring Hill, who show up at the town hall meetings, who register on the government's wait list for doctors, who write letters to the editor, who cry out for help because they don't have a family doctor, they're basically told by this government to go home and give up too, Mr. Speaker. Where is the vision? And I got to say this, Mr. Speaker, in the time I have left, making the same promises over and over again is not a vision. Because sooner or later, the people figure this out. 2013 election, the Liberal Party promised a doctor for every Nova Scotian. Promised to extend the film tax credit for 5 years, guaranteed, so the film industry could grow, among other promises. 2017, where are we? Fewer families have doctors today than back then. 40,000 fewer by the most recent count have a doctor today. The film tax credit wasn't extended for 5 years, it was cut. And we have an industry that's a third the size today that it was then. And those jobs are gone, Mr. Speaker. Well, you know, it's clearly lost on this government in this throne speech, but it is not the role of government to tell people to go home and give up. It is the role of government to inspire them, to show them that there is a brighter future, to show them that they have all it takes to stand on their own 2 feet, to show them that this province has all it takes to be successful, to give them hope that tomorrow will be better, that family doctors are coming, that mental health will be there, that the jobs for your kids are underway as we speak, and that we can build a better province. That's what elections are supposed to be about. That's what throne speeches are supposed to be about. What happened to those days, Mr. Speaker? Well, in this throne speech, Nova Scotians are wondering, where's the vision? And the big answer that they got from this government was, there is none, go home and give up. Thank you very much.
Hear, hear.
I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With unanimous consent of the House, I ask that we revert back to the order of business, introduction of bills.
Is it agreed? The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Repeal Chapter 34 of the Acts of 2015, the Public Services Sustainability 2015 Act.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre begs leave to introduce an act entitled the Public Services Sustainability 2015 Act.
Bill number 3, an act to repeal Chapter 34 of the Acts of 2015, the Public Services Sustainability 2015 Act.
Order that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now ask that we return to address and reply.
Thank you. The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once in the late 70s, my wife and I were camping in the southwestern United States, and this was at the time of the great gas shortage that was taking place around those years. It was quite a sharp situation, and the President, Jimmy Carter, was going to address the nation on this gas shortage. But where we were camping, there was only one family that had a radio that was strong enough to bring in the President's address. And this was an extended family from rural West Texas who were camping near to us, and they invited us to come over and join their family circle to hear the President's address. And so the President gave the speech, and then there was quite a silence as everybody kind of turned to an older gentleman who was plainly the opinion maker in that extended clan. And after a few seconds silence, the older gentleman said, "That there were the sorriest dang speech I ever heard." And I was reminded of this proclamation yesterday as we heard the words of this Liberal administration expressed by the Lieutenant Governor in the speech from the throne, which was as sorry a piece of obfuscatory fluff as any of us is apt to be exposed to. Now this...
Order, please. Order. Order, please. The Leader of the New Democratic Party has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now this sorriness, which I speak, has a number of dimensions. I'd like to begin by speaking to the dimension of the speech's sorriness, which is comprised of its empty, self-congratulatory tone. A kind of tone which indicates a government, in my view, short both on insight and on self-awareness, and thus unfittingly puffed up and pleased about itself. What could be less appropriate? Certainly there isn't anything in the record of the government's first term that calls for a great deal of self-congratulation. The morale and motivation of the most qualified group of teachers in the history of our province undermined by the imposition of a contract. Over 100,000 people in the province without a doctor, emergency rooms overrun or closed, and hospitals plugged with patients waiting for non-existent spaces in nursing homes. The film and television business thrown into disruptive chaos, leading to the forced exodus of some of the most creative and project-minded, project-capable people in the province. And there's nothing either in this administration's May 30th election result that calls for a great deal of chest thumping on their part. The loss of 7 seats, the support of a total of 21% of eligible voters, parlayed by the absurd vagaries of the first-past-the-post system into a skin-of-your-eyeballs-bare majority. No, it's a moment for something better than triumphalist self-glorification. And it's worth noting that successful organizations, successful companies, successful governments all are marked by the way that they take moments of this kind and make them into moments of renewal and recalibration and reflection. And what might that kind of renewal or recalibration look like? It could easily take the form of a new dedication to listening, the form of admitting perhaps to past imperfections, the form maybe of seeking to improve oneself in the spirit of humility and learning. But we look in vain here in the speech of the throne for this kind of insight. This Liberal administration brings to mind, rather, for me, the last federal administration of Stephen Harper, for whom the achievement of a majority in the election of 2011 seemed to unleash a streak of authoritarian dogmatism. This Liberal government is like an oil furnace that's seen better days. You get up in the morning and the house is freezing and you go down to hit the reset button and you hit the reset button, but nothing happens. There's a reset failure. And when you have the reset failure, that's when you know you're dealing with a troubled piece of gear. A wise and prudent government, under wise and prudent leadership, would have taken the moment offered by the renewal of its mandate to reach out, and to adjust, and to reconsider freshly the nature of its path, particularly in the light of the terrible setback in our schools that has resulted from the contract imposed earlier this year. But what has been the principal path forged by the by the current administration since the May 30th election? The principal path is the proclamation of Bill 148 on August 22nd, by which the government took the authoritarian pedal they'd already had to the mat in the case of teachers and drove it through the floorboards for the rest of Nova Scotia's public sector. There were, as we all know, two sets of speeches here at the People's House yesterday. There was the speech from the throne, and there was, perhaps we could call them, there were the speeches from the steps, as hundreds of nurses, personal care workers, nursing home workers, and others gathered to demonstrate their dismay for the law that imposes a 2-year wage freeze and ends previously bargained retirement severance payments. The speeches from the steps were far more edifying than what was on offer here inside this House yesterday, I must tell you. And for those members who may have missed my own few comments there, which I was very grateful to have amplified in through the windows of the chamber while the House awaited the Lieutenant Governor, I will offer this short summary. The very institutions of democracy which we uplift and venerate around the throne speech, are institutions which have been trampled and diminished, I think it is not an exaggeration to say spat upon, by this particular piece of legislation. All across Nova Scotia, in a few short weeks, the people of our communities are going to go and assemble at cenotaphs. And at the heart of those assemblies, they're going to be remembering sacrifices made in wartime for democracy. A part of that democracy is the right to live in a society where the right is protected to freely and fairly bargain. At the same time, it is unfair and, in my judgment, less than moral for a government to say to let us say, workers in housekeeping departments of nursing homes making $14.50 an hour, that they are not worth having the right to bargain a cost of living increase, even while the same government declares a budget surplus of $150 million. And two, it is the case that it is, Bill 148 is nothing less than an attack on the women of Nova Scotia, who make up 64% of the public sector whose incomes will be frozen by this legislation. Now, the matter was, in the words of my rural West Texas friend years ago, the sorriest dang speech, because of many things, but also because of its defining absences and its omissions. Now, every speech takes its meaning from its context. But what was the context of this speech from the throne? Its context is September, in which we've learned that Nova Scotia is nowhere near the middle of the pack when it comes to the area of child poverty, that rather, child poverty in Nova Scotia is the worst across the country. The context of this speech from the throne is a September in which we have learned that Nova Scotia is nowhere near the national average in terms of the financial accessibility of post-secondary education, but that in fact we have the single fastest rising tuition anywhere in Canada. The context of this speech from the throne is a summer just passed, in which we learned that personal insolvencies had increased dramatically in Nova Scotia this year, and that 7,500 full-time jobs have been lost in the province alone, just in this season which has just concluded. And as we hold all this struggle for so many people, all this difficulty to open up doors of opportunity, as we hold this present to our minds, the question can't help but arise for us: what have the newly elected Liberals brought forward to address the suffering of this economic crisis that is before us? And the answer is that, since their re-election, the main economic fiscal initiative of this government has been to declare a budget surplus of $150 million, thereby, in my judgment, demonstrating clearly that for them, the value of an accumulated budget surplus is something that looms larger than the people's unanswered needs and pain. I'm reminded of the current situation in the United Kingdom politically, where the Conservative Party in the June election was much diminished despite managing to hang on to power, but where their downward trajectory is plain, and where this has not seemed to bring about a great deal of reflection on the limits of their emphasis on achieving a balanced budget at any cost. And that this prompted one recent commentator to say that there's all the world of difference between a political party which is, the word he used was, a political party which is inclined in the direction of a fiscally conservative approach, all the difference between a political party which has that inclination and a political party, on the other hand, which becomes fixated, obsessed with balanced budgets. That fixation, rather, he wrote, is a sign of a waning political formation, grasping about dogmatically as it declines. What we have before us in Nova Scotia is a government that has moved from an inclination in a fiscally conservative direction to fixation, obsession with budget surpluses, the effect of which is that the business of our province is being conducted by a government which has its earplugs in when it comes to the cries and the needs and the financially founded suffering of the people of the province. If I may formulate this in the language of my own tradition, the biblical tradition, I am reminded of a place in the New Testament where Jesus is speaking about the essential responsiveness of the Creator. Speaking about the responsiveness of the Creator to people's needs, he says, "Which of you, if your child asks for bread, would give them a stone? Or if they ask for a fish, would give them a snake?" But this is exactly the posture of the present government. The people of Nova Scotia are asking for the bread, the fish, the social investments that will make it possible to pay the rent, to find a family doctor, to be able to improve your picture in the future by affordably going to school beyond grade 12, to be able to find a job that pays you enough for an apartment, not just a room. And what have our people received? The stones, the snakes, the cold comfort of a greater accumulated surplus in the provincial budget. No, it is, this speech from the throne, it is the sorriest dang speech because of all the needed investments in people's lives that are not being made, in which the speech leaves hidden and fogged out from our view. And what is any sorrier than a discourse which is empty because it grasps no better future, because it's absent of the element of vision? For quite a number of years, I was part of a group of parents in the upper part of the Musquodoboit Valley who every couple of years would gather up all the 12, 13, and 14-year-olds in our community and take them on a trip to Ottawa where they could experience firsthand the institutions of parliamentary democracy. One of the things we were always at pains to see that all of the kids who made this trip were made aware of was when they went up in the elevator in the Peace Tower at the House of Commons, they would be made aware of the place where it is carved in the stonework of our Parliament's Peace Tower, these words: "Where there is no vision, the people perish." And the speech from the throne that is before us speaks, in my view, of a government which is perishing in just this sense. A government which is something like what the author Ernst Bloch was talking about once when he said that sometimes that there are institutions that might just as well run up a flag that says, "Hooray, we've run out of ideas." And what an irony that this should be the case on the week when Allan J. MacEachen is laid to rest, when all of Nova Scotia is standing with respect before the breadth of economic grasp and social vision that there was about his life's work. When the guaranteed income supplement was being instituted, do you not think there were many, many voices that said, "Oh, that might be a good thing, that supplement for older people's incomes, but we can't afford it, can we?" And when Medicare was being brought forward, do you not think there were voices that said, "Oh, that would be a wonderful thing, but it can't be done because we haven't got the money"? Of course there were such voices. And what a sad thing it is to look out across a government here today that is such a washed out, ossified mini shadow, even of its own liberal tradition, that its vision of a future is limited to hand-wringing talk about budget surpluses, budget being balanced, about a fiscal plan. It's the sorriest dang speech, because at every level it speaks the language of its authors, which is the discourse of disappointment. But I want to register, Mr. Speaker, the truth that this is not the only language that is being spoken here in this Assembly. That I and our caucus in the New Democratic Party believe that there are doors that it is within the capacity of our people to open. Doors which open to better futures. Futures with communities that are re-enlivened. Futures with people taking hold of the steering wheels of their lives and moving them in directions that are more promising and engaging. Futures where people's lives are circumscribed less by the grey power of grim necessity and characterized instead more by interest and inclusion, and may I even say perhaps by hope. What, after all, was it that made it possible for our grandparents and our great-grandparents, coming out of the Depression and the war, to open up the doors represented by pensions, the baby bonus, unemployment insurance? Did they have some magical capacities that we're lacking? And what was it about our parents and grandparents' generations, right in the midst of the years when the Western world was awash with babies? What was it that made it possible for them to open up doors represented by Medicare? Did they have some ability to press things forward that has since gone missing? I don't think so. What they did not have to contend with, however, is the weight that sits on us. The weight of having heard from so many different angles of the compass, give up, this is as good as it's going to get, you're booked into the no future hotel, hunker down and try to have a few not too unpleasant days, for nothing else is possible because we can't afford it. Let me say something as sensible as it is obvious. Of course we can afford it. Of course we can afford to build a Nova Scotia where not one person lays awake at night and worries about how they're going to possibly get a doctor to attend to their multiple medications. Of course we can afford to build a Nova Scotia where no young couple is unable to see their way forward to starting a family because all of the mental space for them is occupied by their crushing educational debt. And of course we can afford to craft a Nova Scotia where no child grows up in a home where the home is so constrained by the absence of enough that the lights of engagement and the lights of delight begin to go out in the child before they even ever get a decent chance to start. I know this is true, and we know that this is true. And we know this is true because we have seen it in the amazing resilience of our people that is evident every day all around us. My own family comes from Rennerton and Kemp and Pleasant Lake and Tuscott and Milton, all in Yarmouth County, where they operated sawmills and farmed and worked on the floor of the cotton mill, and I've certainly seen it there, and I've certainly seen it in all of them. And I was myself brought up in Berwick and Spryfield, where the courage and the tenacity of everyday life has always been in great supply. I served 2 decades as the Community United Church minister in Upper Musquodoboit, where despite the fact there were no such organizations in Nova Scotia at the time, the people built the first funeral co-op in the province, which serves now 30 communities in central Nova Scotia and has over 3,000 members. I served until becoming leader of this party, a new church in downtown Sydney, comprised of Baptist and United congregations, a type of union which has not been accomplished anywhere in Canada in this form, but which stands as a beacon of strength today against the forces of the decline of civil society that are in ample supply in industrial Cape Breton. We are, in Nova Scotia, a little bit like the Hants County poet, the late Allan, who was himself a very big man and who had several poet colleagues who were also very large and thick-shouldered, and who was asked once, "Why are the Nova Scotia poets all so big?" And Allan said, "Oh, that's easy, because the small ones all get killed off." If we were not the determined, flexible, multifaceted, cooperative, independent, and tenacious people that we in Nova Scotia are, a century and a half of marginalization and neglect within Confederation would have had us folded up a long, long time ago. But we're still here. And it is an offense to all the struggles by which we've got to where we are to suggest that we don't have the capacity, because we do, to open up the doors to something so much fairer, kinder, decenter, and better. So I want to ask you to come with me in your imaginations as I bring these reflections towards a conclusion. I want to ask you to come with me in your imaginations down a road. And the road in question is the Sydney-Glace Bay Highway. I want to invite you to come in your imagination. You can do it with your eyes open. I want you to come with me, go heading east out the Sydney-Glace Bay Highway, and when you get to the Thames and Reserve on your left, I want you to make the right with me that goes down in the Passchendaele direction. And as we go down and make that direction, we don't go very far. I want to invite you to come with me and make a left. And the left we make off of that road is going to take us into Greenwood Cemetery. And we're going to drive in Greenwood Cemetery in a little ways, then we're going to circle to the right, and there we're going to see the headstone of the greatest Nova Scotian, James Bryson McLaughlin, the leader and defender of the miners of Cape Breton. And I want to invite you in our imaginations to just get out once we come there. And perhaps we might want to put a rose beside the headstone. And then I want to invite you to step back and to look at the headstone and to take in the words that are inscribed there. They're from the biblical book of Proverbs. Open your mouth and plead the cause of the poor. This throne speech and this government fails to follow this instruction, and we in the New Democratic Party will not be making this same mistake. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I'll now call on the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That concludes the government's House business for today. The House will meet again on Monday, September 25th, between the hours of 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. Following daily routine, we will move to address and supply.
Order. The motion is to meet again on Monday, 25th September, 6 to 10 p.m. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Motion carried. We stand adjourned. Guess it's you, Pete.